The Clone Wars represents a major issue for the narrative that George counted the EU as canon because the Clone Wars retcons several elements of the Clone Wars multimedia project. For those who don't know, this is all the Clone Wars books, comics, games, TV content from 2002 to 2005. And there are no questions that it does so. And on a personal note, I'll side with the purists. It'd be nice if everything had lined up and it was all Gucci. But the truth is, it doesn't, just like the prequel trilogy. The Clone Wars was the biggest Lucasfilm Star Wars project post-Revenge of the Sith and pre-Disney. George Lucas personally funded the show and allowed it to keep going, even as viewership constantly declined and the show's cost only grew and grew. EU purists tend to come up with a few narratives about George and his involvement in TCW in order to downplay the significance of the issue of TCW. Myth number 1. George was not involved. Period. Therefore, EU issues come from Dave Filoni, and TCW wasn't his vision. Honestly, I just don't see how purists could suggest that even though George Lucas personally funded the show with a pilot movie budgeting $8.5 million from his own pocketbook and episodes that cost roughly $1 million each to make, he just kind of stood off to the side and let Dave Filoni do his thing? And if the EU continuity issues weren't okay with George, why did he not do anything? He might not have known about every single one, but he surely would have heard about some, which we'll talk about later. Myth number 2 is that George was very minimally involved, therefore EU issues come from Dave Filoni. I would offer mostly the same response to this as myth number 1. The only difference here is that this seems like an attempt to try to account for the facts that George and others have stated he was involved, without having to completely ignore them to preserve their argument. Myth number 3. George was initially very involved in TCW, but after early seasons he stepped away, and he left continuity to Dave, which means any problems with the EU came from him, and Dave sometimes went behind George's back and let things get in the final cut of the episode and go to air without George knowing. This one honestly is a whole lot we're going to dive into over the next several minutes, but I'll just add about the whole Dave behind George's back thing. If Dave's really doing that and bragging about that publicly, why would George not do anything? The idea he was personally funding a show going to air on a channel with a couple million viewers tuning in every week, and he was just oblivious to his lead showrunner doing the complete opposite of what he wanted seems like a stretch. Especially this idea that no one else would have ever told George. And finally, myth number 4. George let the prequel hate get to him, and his vision was compromised, but the Clone Wars multimedia project was prior to that, so TCW can be written off as not being George's true vision. Honestly, I have a bit more respect for this one, as they're at least owning the fact that, yeah, George was responsible for a lot of the show's continuity errors, and they're just trying to shine a different light on it. The only thing is now they sound like eerily similar to the 2000s era prequel haters who also claim George lost his way, and he wasn't the same guy he was when he made the original trilogy, but was now just some soup milking it on the Star Wars cash cow. But again, like the others, we'll address this one too. Let's dive in. We'll look at some quotes from George Lucas and others that have stated about him and his involvement in TCW. Keep in mind, we're mainly focusing here on how the quote ties into his involvement and his thoughts on the show, not him and either thinking the EU is canon or not thinking it's canon. During an exchange at Comic-Con with Steve Sansweet, a fan asked Steve how the TV show fit into the canon, and he said, George will be involved in the TV series. It'll be pretty close to the top of the hierarchy. The Clone Wars series on Cartoon Network is very much a part of canon because it leads right up to Episode 3, so these certainly will be too. The fan then responded, so this will be like on the level of the screenplays and stuff. Okay, thanks. So, clearly TCW was meant to be canon and George was planning to be involved. This was in 2005. Now let's fast forward to 2008, which is notable because this is the same year the film came out, and by this point, with how production is generally ran on Lucasfilm Animation, they would have been wrapping up on Season 1 and deep into Season 2 at the least. George told Starlog, so I only really have the films and now the television series. I have my own little world to worry about. Again, by this point, TCW has been in production for a while, and George is equating the show on par with the films. And to him, it's all the same. Something I believe I've already alluded to, but will continue to be relevant, is that while Star Wars fans and licensing differentiate between the films and TCW as far as the canon tiers go, George didn't make the tiers, and he doesn't use them. As he's made clear many times already, there are essentially 2 tiers to him. The EU is one, and the films is the other. And now from this point in time onwards, he lumps TCW in with the films. To him, there is no distinction, so anyone wanting to discard TCW for some tier-level reason while simultaneously claiming to be all about true George Lucas Star Wars must accept that for George, his true vision of Star Wars made no tier-level differentiation. To Total Film in 2008, George said, "The movies and the TV shows are all under my control." Again, he is owning TCW. It's under his control, not Dave Filoni's, George's. Two quotes from early May from Leland Chee state, "To clarify this point just a little bit further, the Clone Wars will not be considered expanded universe. They'll be ranked up there with the movies. T-canon in its entirety is not supposed to be considered part of the EU pillar, but part of the Lucas pillar." This falls right in line with what I just said. Everyone loves to use Leland, right? Well, here he is in 2008 saying T-canon is essentially the same as G-canon. They are on par with each other and above the other canon tiers. Some may ask why Chi wouldn't just lump TCW in with canon. Honestly, I don't know. But I have a theory. It's either one, they just wanted to separate between films and television, or two, because T-canon was going to include TCW and Underworld, they wanted to distinguish from the films due to other people's involvement. While TCW is absolutely George's vision, Dave also played a major role in that, and surely the same would go for whoever ran the live-action show, whereas the films were much more purely George and only George. Now, I don't think that 100% makes sense, because the films clearly had more than just George's influence on them. I mean, shoot, he didn't even officially direct two of them, and obviously, George outranked Dave on TCW, and TCW was his show, but that may have been what Chi was going for. I honestly don't know, but nonetheless, that doesn't change the fact that even Leland is basically putting it on par with George's films. To bring up another Leland quote, "The three pillars that George Lucas refers to has first a pillar that is part of the Star Wars universe that George follows and has direct control over, namely the movies and the television series. Second pillar includes the portions of the Star Wars universe created by Lucas licensing that includes the video games, books, and toys that George exhibits less direct control over. Both the first and second pillars are treated as official Star Wars continuity." Again, George has directed control over TCW in the same way he had direct control over the films. And just in case anyone tries to say this is a quote that works against me on George and the EU canonicity, he's talking about canon for the company, not George. Speaking of George, let's go to another 2008 quote from him, a quote after the film released and before the show aired. He said, "I am the father of our Star Wars movie world, the film entertainment, the features, and now the animated film and television series, and I am going to do a live-action series. Those are all things I am very involved in. I set them up, and I train the people, and I go through them all. I am the father, that's my work." Here, George is again claiming he is very involved. He sets up the people for that, and he goes through all the episodes just like the films. George was claiming heavy involvement, not just a checklist of approvals. He is comparing the involvement of his on the films to that of the TV series. In an interview titled "The Making of Star Wars: The Clone Wars," George said this, "One thing this gives me the chance to do is to go out and broaden the canvas of what Star Wars is about." So this is a way of explaining Anakin's rise to being a full-fledged Jedi, and at the same time, the growing relationship between Obi-Wan and Anakin as pals. And in order to do that, we needed somebody to take on the role of the younger person who's being taught and is adding a certain dynamic that a student brings to these stories. This is interesting for a few reasons. Not only is he saying he's the one doing this, and not only is he talking actively about Ahsoka and her role in the series and why she was there, but he is saying TCW is a way for him to broaden the canvas of Star Wars. But didn't the EU already do that? Or is it because he doesn't count that as real Star Wars in his mind? He said this is a way of explaining Anakin's rise to Jedihood and Annie and Obi becoming friends. But wasn't that all already covered in the Clone Wars multimedia project? Or is it because George doesn't count that? I certainly know if Dave made these quotes, purists would say this is to Dave ignoring the EU. In fact, I know one YouTuber named Star Wars Scran who did do this to Dave and other TCW writers in a video series called The Continuity Wars. But now here George is doing the exact same thing. In an interview with ComingSoon.net, George said, "Genndy did most of the animation and most of the stories for the first experimental series. In this one, I'm pretty much following the mythology and the rules of the features, so it's a little bit different. But it's very much like the features except in animation." A couple things to note. Not only is George saying TCW is essentially the same as the features but animated, but it's something in line with the mythology and rule of the films, something he has stated before that the books did not do. But he's also attributing the 03 series to Genndy and taking credit for this one, implying he wasn't really behind the 03 series and that he is definitely behind doing this one. In that same interview, he also says, "We've been doing this for 3 years. We have 1 year finished. We're in the middle of the second year. I've written the third year. We expect this to go on for at least 5 or 6 years. I mean, what I'm doing is a film called Red Tails. I've been working on for years, and then I'm working on a live-action Star Wars TV series, and we're in the script stage. That probably won't come out for a couple of years. Then I'm going to do my own films. I'm basically, you might say, retire and just work on the hobby movies, and after that, well, as a matter of fact, I'm working on it tomorrow. We're getting towards the script and probably start shooting before the end of the year. It should come out sometime next year maybe. A lot of good stuff to unpack here. First off, he says TCW has been in development for 3 years. Season 1 is already done. Season 2 is in the middle of production, and he, not someone else, he has written the 3rd year. Not only is he expressing his involvement with the first couple seasons, but he is taking writing credit for Season 3. So anyone who says TCW did not come from him, at least in regards to Seasons 1 through 3, more than half the show that aired under his watch, mind you, this should shut down the debate. George is personally owning TCW Seasons 1 through 3 here, and the stories presented in them. And it's not the generic we, because he says we about Seasons 1 and 2 being mostly done, but he says, I've written the 3rd year. Also worthy to note, this was 2008, and Season 3 wouldn't air for 2 more years, yet the stories were hashed out already. The last George Lucas quote from before the Disney buyout that I'll present for TCW comes in 2011. So if in 2008 they have already some story work done for Season 3, then they easily have Season 5, if not some of Season 6, being worked on in 2011. Another quote I found, and one I've sometimes seen to go against TCW, confusingly enough, is from Starlog Magazine 370, where George states, "The Clone Wars is like a footnote to the live-action features. The features are Anakin Skywalker's story, so when you go between episodes 2 and 3, it's like there's a little asterisk that says more about the Clone Wars, the animated series. But it doesn't really have anything to do with Anakin's story about his fall to the dark side. In the animated series, Anakin is simply a normal person. It's consistent with the live-action films. But in the movies, you never see Anakin as a normal person. He's always struggling. So this gives us a chance to broaden that and show that Anakin was a regular guy, just like he was in Episode 1. Some interesting stuff. First off, he is saying TCW is part of the features. It's a footnote. Him saying this isn't really part of Anakin's story does not mean it has nothing to do with the film's continuity-wise, but it simply means to get the gist of Anakin's story, watch 1 through 6. You don't need to watch all of TCW to understand his story. Also interesting is he notes TCW as a footnote. I've never seen him describe the EU as a footnote. Usually it's always referring to the EU as its own thing, or its own world, or a separate universe, yet he doesn't really seem to do that with TCW. It's funny though, as George says here that Anakin is consistent with the films, and explains why he might seem a little different even though he isn't. We'll get to that in just a second on the next quote. So let's continue. Now, it should be noted that George did a lot of active press for the 2008 film when it was in theaters. So the next few quotes come from various press interviews he did, which is funny to think about since purists will often claim he wasn't really involved. If so, why did he do press coverage? To Star Movies, when I was doing Episode 3, I was sort of lamenting the fact that the Clone Wars really has nothing to do with Anakin Skywalker's story of descending into the dark side, and the other part was that because he's struggling, he has this personal interior struggle. His character became very one-sided, very angst-ridden, and I said it would be fun to do something just as a footnote to sort of explain how Anakin and Obi-Wan, stopped being sort of edgy with each other and became friends, and then became partners, and eventually became a team, and how Anakin settled down and matured a little bit, which is what happens when you become a parent or you become a teacher or something. You have to teach another, in this case, a Padawan learner, Ahsoka. It would be nice it's not part of the plot of him, but it does show him as a normal human being, which is the only time I got to do was when he was 10 years old. And I never got to explore that part, so I said I could take this animated series that we developed with Gindi, and, I could turn this into a real live series and also explore my interest in animation. This is a lot of good juicy bits here. Oftentimes, I've seen the character of Anakin as portrayed in TCW being criticized as out of line with the prequel trilogy. I don't personally subscribe to that, but it would appear that this didn't originate from Dave Filoni, but from the maker himself, George Lucas. He says Anakin is at the worst points of his life in the films, but TCW is everyday normal adult Anakin. Very interesting. So anyone who wants to claim that they want to celebrate true George Lucas Star Wars must accept Anakin's portrayal in TCW as it came from the maker himself. And the other bit, he talks about Ahsoka and her being Anakin's Padawan and the reasoning behind it. I've also seen some purists say Ahsoka doesn't fit the prequel trilogy either, and that the Jedi giving Anakin a Padawan after Attack of the Clones makes no sense. That's okay if you feel that way personally, but now you must accept this is a decision approved by, if not directly from, the maker himself. Ahsoka as Anakin's Padawan is true George Lucas Star Wars. And to any still questioning George's position on the EU, I ask this simple question. The Clone Wars multimedia project had pretty much filled out the timeline of the war by this point. There wasn't really any territory left uncharted. There was not a single mention of Ahsoka or of Anakin having a Padawan in the Clone Wars multimedia project, nor a single appearance of the character Ahsoka Tano. Surely George would know this, especially since he was part of her creation. He wouldn't know the details and specifics of all the war stories, sure, but he would have had to have known that nothing prior to this depicted Anakin having a Padawan, especially since the micro-series made no allusion to her either, and that was something he was tangentially involved in at the very least. EU purists love to say George was involved in the EU and approved of it. So if this is true, he should know the broad strokes, and again, know that Anakin did not have a Padawan. In fact, one of the biggest criticisms about TCW when it came out, aside from Ahsoka being an annoying character, is the fact that Anakin having a Padawan seemed to be one of the largest retcons in the franchise. So to all you purists out there who think George saw the EU as canon to his Star Wars, and the true continuation of his story outside the films, I ask you, how do you reconcile the fact that George was aware of and okay with Ahsoka Tano and her being Anakin's Padawan when this is a giant slap in the face to the continuity of the Clone Wars multimedia project? Even if you think he wasn't really involved in the series or got less and less involved as time went on, he was a part of her introduction to the universe and is Anakin's Padawan. How do you reconcile that? I've tried asking several EU purists I engage with online, and unless YouTube notifications failed to inform me of a response to my comment, I have yet to receive an answer. If you have an answer, please let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious, because to me, the only answer that makes sense is that to George, the Clone Wars multimedia project was never canon to him, so introducing Ahsoka didn't create any retcons with the EU because to him, it was separate. Now then, another George Lucas quote is from an interview with EW. I'm just starting to work on the scripts now for the live-action series. We finished the first years of Clone Wars, and we're in the middle of working on the second year. I'm finishing the scripts for the third year, and now I'm working on the scripts for the first year of the live-action show. Smiles. So it's a lot of scripts. Again, to an alternate source, he is reiterating the same information. He is involved with TCW, and he is involved in the writing process. The stories came from George. At the world premiere for the '08 film, George said, "This is the very first premiere I've ever had for any movie I've ever made." Interesting. He's not calling TCW a Dave Filoni film that he financed and approved. He's calling it a film he made. He's owning it as a film he made. And just in case anyone's confused, by premiere he's talking about like a big celebratory event for the first ever public showing of the film. Something all the Disney films have had normally a couple days before the masses were able to see them. I know that could be confusing, so I just wanted to clarify. That's what the world premiere is. Another quote he gave at the same premiere is, "That first stuff that came off was so brilliant. I looked at it on the big screen and said, this is too good for television. This should actually be a feature." Well, I'm pretty sure that this one was common knowledge already. Just wanted to add it again because George Lucas was involved and he was the one who turned the film from 4 episodes into a feature film. In another press interview, he said, "Ahsoka was there because I need a Padawan learner for Anakin to sort of settle him down a little bit to make him more responsible, and the best way to do that is to become a parent or teacher. Then you have to sort of think about what you're doing a little more." This circles back to both the Anakin personality issue and the Ahsoka issue. He said the reason Ahsoka was there is Anakin's Padawan, and this is the way of maturing Anakin up a bit. I've seen some EU fans state before that Anakin's maturity between films was explored in the Clone Wars multimedia project, with some dubbing it a natural progression of maturity as someone who had to grow up and fight through 3 years of war. Wouldn't George know this? Shouldn't he know Anakin's maturity between films was already explored and explained that? Or is it, simply that his version of it, because to him, Clone Wars multimedia project is not canon? Moving on to the behind the scenes from the Clone Wars, while George never gave in-person commentary interviews for the behind-the-scenes featurettes for the show, he did do them for the film. I also want to state all these can be found online. On one, he stated, "With the Clone Wars, we're showing there's a lot more stories to tell." You could construe this to simply mean Star Wars is not done, it's still going, and sure, but isn't it weird that he's picking this era, implying there isn't told stories in this era, when in reality the Clone Wars multimedia project already told the Clone Wars stories? In the same featurette, he said, "The interesting thing about the Clone Wars is that in the normal course of the Skywalker saga, it's not told, it's skipped over. We never get into the details of what happens during the war. Obviously, during the war, there's lots and lots of stories, Very exciting, action, drama, heartbreak, and comedy. And this idea was intriguing to me because it really did allow me to broaden the canvas of what Star Wars is about. There's enough time over the period of the series to deal with a lot of the other Jedi. Other characters were not dealing primarily with the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, we're dealing with a series of episodes. Again, interesting. First off, again, he's stating he's involved in the telling of these stories. But it's that same broaden the canvas terminology that seems to ignore the EU, especially since he refers to telling stories about other Jedi characters who undoubtedly already got stories in the EU. Catherine Winder, executive producer at Lucasfilm Animation, said, "When it comes to music, George really has pushed the envelope on the series. He likes to experiment with all different kinds of ethnic and rhythmic sounds. He loves the drums. He really wanted a rich soundtrack for both the television series and the movie. So the feel of the music for TCW? All from George." In a behind-the-scenes featurette for Season 1, Episode 10, Catherine Winder also states, "So after Mr. Takayuchi had finished his storyboard, he actually got to sit with George Lucas, and we went through frame by frame what his vision was, and then combine that with George's ideas and notes. Mr. Takayuchi also said, I was a little nervous and also very surprised that Mr. Lucas was so enthusiastic and so passionate. Mr. Lucas tweaked a lot of my drawings. Usually when you change things on the fly, the story suffers, but all these changes made sense. I was amazed by his skill." Both clearly state George was pretty involved, at the very least with this specific episode. The behind the scenes for this episode is also accompanied by clips of George being very hands-on with this one. This is interesting because this episode is a layer of Grievous, the episode that gives some backstory on Grievous. EU purists will claim this was one of the early examples of Dave stabbing George in the back for changing the backstory of Grievous that allegedly came from Lucas himself. But as we literally are able to see and hear, George was very hands-on with this episode. The backstory isn't just spoken, but shown in the episode as we see several statues showing Grievous' slow morphing from the warrior he used to be into the cyborg he eventually became. Assuming the new backstory didn't come from him, he then at the very least was aware of it and approved it. And if it really did come from him for the EU, then why change it here? He wouldn't change a backstory established for the EU unless, could it be because maybe he didn't count the EU backstory as part of his personal canon? Going back to Catherine Winder, in an interview with StarWars.com in 2009, she stated, "I feel my role is to help support and find any way possible to bring to life the creative vision as set out by George and realized on a daily basis by Dave. With George, it's focusing more on the larger issues of the show and the technology, as well as his concept of where he wants the show and the technology, as well as his concept of where he wants the show and the production system to be in the years ahead. I also go through the particular system to be in the years ahead. I also go through the particular production, budgetary, and delivery challenges with George so he understands not only what we're dealing with today, but also how we're going to get to where he wants us to go in the future. As far as my interaction with Dave, it's more on the ground floor dealing with the specific production challenges and difficulties of creating a show of this scale and complexity. Dave is extremely fluent in the Star Wars universe, as well as George's storytelling sensibility, and he's absolutely vital to the process and to realizing George's vision." Interesting how she lays this out. She not only describes George as more of an overseer and Dave more involved in the day-to-day run-of-the-mill show running duties, something Dave has also stated, but she also attributes the show as being George's vision and something Dave is capturing. He's not producing Dave's vision, but George's. And even though she says Dave is more day-to-day and George is more overseer, she still acquaints the whole show with George's vision and also describes him being involved in typical things a television executive producer was involved with, demonstrating it wasn't just a courtesy credit. Henry Gilroy, TCW writer, stated in 2009 regarding EU author Karen Travis's departure, "It is unfortunate that Karen is moving on because of her opinion that canon is being changed. I guess the big problem is the assumption that her work is canon in the first place. After working with George on the Clone Wars series, I know there are elements of her work that are not in line with his vision of Star Wars, and in my mind, only George Lucas' Star Wars is canon. Everything else is expanded universe. Here he is clearly stating some of the EU stuff is not in line with his vision of Star Wars, and that the Clone Wars is something part of Lucas's canon. Rob Coleman also had some early development and involvement with TCW and directed a couple episodes. Keep in mind, Rob is an animation supervisor and someone who worked heavily on the special effects for all three prequels, including being the mastermind behind CGI Yoda and the Yoda fight in Attack of the Clones, as shown in the ILM documentary on Disney+. He gave a statement to Star Wars Insider 107 saying, "Dave Filoni is the supervising director. He He works directly with George Lucas and the writers to create an overall plan for all of the episodes each season. He's there at the beginning with the producer. It usually takes a couple of days to a week, and they plan out in a very rough form what will happen. They come up with episode synopses, which are about a paragraph long for each episode, and describe what happens to the heroes, what the problems are, and what gets solved. The writing team divides up the episodes between them, and they start writing. Once the first drafts come in, Dave and George read them and make notes and decisions. They start choosing episodes that are actually going to be made. That's when an episodic director gets involved. They'd call the director in and say, "Rob, we've got an R2-D2 show coming up." In my case, it was a two-parter, and here's an early draft. The director gives notes as a fresh pair of eyes to the story. Then in maybe a few days or a week, a shooting draft is ready. At that point, the episodic director works with the storyboard artist, doing storyboards on paper or a computer, or in my case, going straight to 3D computer graphics to map out what the scenes are going to look like. You maybe spend 6 weeks mapping out the whole show, so you have a version of the show done in storyboards or in computer animatics that describes visually what the show's going to look like. There might be a still image of Anakin standing, and I would record people in the studio for temp dialogue and work with editor Jason Tucker to cut it all together. So it's the length, but nothing's animated at that stage, and nothing's got color. It's usually just black and white or gray. I'd present that to George, and then he would give me notes. I'd do a revision on that and present it for a final look. Then George would sign off on it. This is very detailed stuff. Not only does this similarly match up with the process Dave Filoni has laid out for how the show is put together, but he attributes all the stories as being a joint production of George and Dave in a writer's room, and then George and Dave jointly approve all those scripts. Not an outline, a script. So any EU contradiction was all approved by George. Sure, maybe George wouldn't know minor details off the top of his head about things the show retcons, but certain details like pacifist Mandalorians, Grievous's new backstory, etc., all these were created by him and approved by him, and all final episodes were approved by George. And even more important to note, Rob describes the writer's room meeting as lasting maybe a week or so. And that's it. A whole season would be planned out. Then after that, George's involvement comes down to signing off and making notes to scripts and then approving the final episodes. George doesn't need to be too involved to still have been heavily involved in the story process. George's work for an entire season could come down to a few weeks' worth, while Dave was there for months. And he still would have basically been behind all the stories and approved the final episodes before they went to air. So even if EU purists want to try to claim that Lucas was hardly around, well, even if that's true, he doesn't need to be around every day for all those stories to have come from him. And the fact that someone else was responsible for the lighting or getting all the animation animated doesn't impact whether this show is George's or not, because at the end of the day, the stories all came from him. If the day-to-day details of animating a show are required to have George's heavy involvement, then let's rule out all 6 films, because a lot of those special effects were handled by ILM, and George wasn't too involved in getting those done. He even told Rob Coleman to figure out the Yoda fight in Attack of the Clones, and he had to plan that from scratch, simply getting George's approval at the end, as he detailed in Season 2, Episode 2 of the ILM documentary. In a 2010 featurette, Jason Tucker, a supervising editor on TCW, stated about Season 2, Episode 6, "At the very first initial cut that we had, Anakin and Luminara were putting the bombs on the top of the super tanks. When George came in, he wanted to flip the shots entirely, so basically all the shots of the bridge were upside down to show Anakin and Luminara were coming basically underneath the bridge, and we were going to destroy the bridge altogether. It's an amazing process watching George work, as we were compiling all this together in the editing room." Again, George was there in the editing room and he was involved. Carrie Silver, TCW producer, not executive producer, just producer, said, "George is the master. He'll pitch out these ideas, these absolute grand visions, and when he does it, you certainly don't have the feeling that he's throwing it out there to see if you can do it. He's throwing it out there basically expecting you to do it." Again, all the stories, they came from George. Talking about a sequence in Season 2, Episode 2, Jason Tucker said, "It was a very hard scene to cut. I remember not only did we have my version and Rob's version, and then Dave's version, and then George's version, and then Dave's version again, and then George's version again. Not only was George there involved in the editing, but what version came out on top? Dave's? Nope, George's." Our next source is a 2011 quote from Katie Lucas, George Lucas's daughter. "I started working on the show when I was 17. I just left for college, and my dad just said, 'You like to write? Here's the story. Why don't you try to do this?' And it ended up being Jedi Crash, Season 1, Episode 13. And I worked independently on a bunch of episodes, and it was my first experience in Season 3 being in an actual writer's room." I just want to pose this. George's daughter was involved. Do you EU purists really truly believe that George would count stories from random 90s era authors as more canon than the stories his own daughter wrote? Stories he essentially tasked her with writing with? At Comic-Con in 2011, Leland said George Lucas dictates what happens in the movies, and he's also contributing to the series, so that's always going to be at the top. Everything else falls right underneath. Again, not only is TCW above the EU, but George was contributing to the series. It wasn't something separate from him. And this comes in 2011. In 2011, George Lucas stated to Sci-Fi Now, "I haven't limited myself with what stories I've wanted to tell. This is Star Wars, and I don't make a distinction between the series and the films. It's just a different format and a different delivery. But the fact of the matter is that our improved processes for the stories have allowed us to tell consistently bigger stories. Our teams are constantly pushing the envelope so that the standard keeps raising itself higher and higher, and we keep asking for more than can be delivered, so we're always reaching and the show is always improving. Each week is a Star Wars feature boiled down to 22 minutes. Just for extra context, right before this, Dave Filoni said the words, "This really feels like classic Star Wars." Then George owns the show as not being anything different to him than the films, which is funny because he seems to like to make distinctions between the films and the EU. This comes from a joint interview Dave and George gave. I put a link on the screen. I highly recommend everyone check it out, as it gives great insight into the two men and how they work together as a pair on this show. Pablo Hidalgo has stated in 2012, pre-Disney buyout, "The most definitive canon of the Star Wars universe is encompassed by the feature films and the television productions in which George Lucas is directly involved. The movies and the Clone Wars television series are what he and his handpicked writers reference when adding cinematic adventures to the Star Wars, however you say that." Not only does Pablo state that George is directly involved, and this is in 2012, but he states George does not really reference or consider the EU when making cinematic adventures. Why would he not reference the EU? Could it be because he doesn't consider it canon? Katie Lucas, talking about Season 4, Episode 20's villains, said, "My father is just very family-oriented. He calls me and goes, 'Katie, we made them brother and sister just like you and Jet.' So even as far as late Season 4, George was still involved in the stories and story changes." Ashley Eckstein added in 2013, "In terms of our show having continuity issues with the EU, I would say that the Clone Wars stories are directly from George Lucas. He's been integrally involved in the show from day one, and he chooses the stories and the outcome." Brent Friedman, a TCW writer, said in 2013, referring to the D-Squad arc, "When we laid out the stories, George said, 'I want to do something different with the second episode.' And everyone went, 'Oh no, what does that mean?' Chuckles. And he said, 'I want it to be an episode about nothing. I want it to be the droids lost to this nothingness, and I want to have the whole thing be an existential crisis, and I want to do it like Mobius used to do. This old cartoon is completely minimalist, and I want it to be completely different than anything we've ever done.'" So there we go. Here George is all the way in Season 5, still guiding the show and giving the stories and taking charge. Gillian Plunkett, an animator, said in 2014, "George had a good idea of what he wanted this thing to be, but the rest of us honestly had no clue." Dave, yes, I know I said I wouldn't bring up Dave quotes, but this one seemed interesting. The first season was largely stories by Henry Gilroy and I, and about halfway through that, George started coming in with like stories that he wanted to tell, and he and I would sit down with the writers, and he would go over the beats of the story, and we would kind of debate and try to help come up with beats of the story, and I would draw every day tons of drawings, and we would outline extensively every episode together. It's basically saying George came in and took over midway through Season 1, supposedly starting with the episode Dooku Captures, is what I've read elsewhere, and everything else came from him. This all aligns with Rob Coleman's quote, and keep in mind, Rob was only there for Season 1 and one Season 2 episode. And even though, according to Dave, not all of Season 1 came from George, Season 1 was still checked over and approved by George, according to Rob. So don't try and use this to discount Season 1 as not true George Star Wars. It was all true George Star Wars. Jason Tucker likewise said, "What I've learned is that George doesn't really work in a vacuum where it's like he's just going to do the story. He also wants to push the technology. He does both, and ZViz is where that technology push was." Just a real quick side note, ZViz gets brought up a few times. I don't know if I spelled that right. I couldn't verify that elsewhere. Again, George was involved. Keith Kellogg, an animation supervisor, referring to George, he was such a big influence on Clone Wars, which was really a thrill, I think, for everybody working up at animation because we got to be so intimately involved with him. Gillian Plunkett also added, the series wouldn't have become what it became if there hadn't been someone pushing that hard to make it more than it already was. Jason Tucker also said, George's impact on the show is definitely editorial. George's impact on the show is definitely story. His love of the serial definitely shines through in that traditional serial way that works every time. I'll be honest, at this point, it's just getting repetitive and boring. Sean Wells, a colorist, said, referring to George, you could tell that he loved the project and he loved the work that he did, and you could see it across the board, that you're doing work that's going to be in front of George. It better be your best. Some might try and slam these as being paid off by the mouse for his final interview, and I mean, I guess that's not out of the realm of possibility, but just consider that while, yes, some of these guys stayed on with Lucasfilm after the buyout, some of them haven't touched Star Wars since TCW. Leland Shee also stated in 2017, what George did with the films and the Clone Wars was pretty much his universe. Again, George was on TCW, and the films in TCW were his universe, not the EU. But ready for some more fun? George didn't stop talking about TCW after the Disney buyout. Unlike the EU, he kept talking about it. And this is the same George who trashed Force Awakens. Yet he still owned TCW as his. Here he is at Star Wars Celebration 2017. That's really why we started the Clone Wars. I said, this is an interesting idea. We could do a lot of stuff in this. So it really came out of the idea that there's a lot of stories there, and I'd like to tell those stories, but would never be able to put them in a theater format because they're more interesting as a long-form story than they are as a short form. Part of it is the stories and being able to play with stories and do things that nobody would ever do. I mean, my whole life is, well, you can't do that. And Dave had to put up with some things that everybody at ILM had to put up with. You know, Dennis Murin and those guys and John Knoll, they've all had to put up with me. I would come in the morning and say, we're going to do this and this and this and this. Their jaws are dropped and they go and they say, oh, he's not really serious, is he? We can't do this. And I'd say, you could do it. Come on, we'll do it. And we did. I pushed them through it and they did it. And they came through it. It was like, you know, everything. A lot of the things we did have never been done before. And that scares everybody because we don't know how to do this. And I said, well, we'll figure it out. We were trying very hard, and I think we succeeded in doing a feature-quality TV show. The lighting, the characters, the animation was all feature-quality, and we did it on a TV budget, and we were able to tell stories and expand the universe and bring in great characters like Ahsoka that we would never have been able to have. Once again, he owns Ahsoka. At that same panel, he shared the stage with Dave Filoni, who said this. When we would find something that a lot of people would say, well, you can't do that, it's the first thing George would say, okay, we're going to do that. From the way we produced Clone Wars, which was not with storyboards traditionally, we did it a completely different way. We had a program George had been developing, and he said, we're going to use this new program. It's not tested, but it will never work unless we put it on a production. I know it'll be difficult, but I need you to do it. And we did it, and the show got incredibly better because of that. George never refuted any of this. Catherine Winder, who left Lucasfilm in 2009, said, and it was our job, more specifically mine and then Dave's, to earn George's trust. The more trust we earned, the more involved he would get. George didn't get less and less involved as time went on. He got more and more involved. Leland Shee said in 2018, Lucas canon, and when I say his canon, I'm talking about what he was doing in the films and what he was doing in the Clone Wars, was hugely important. But what we were doing in the books wasn't really on his radar. Again, George's stuff was separate, and he didn't really count the EU. There are some even more interesting ones. When George gave his interview for the Star Wars Archives, which was around March 2018, according to a memo from Paul Duncan, George referenced the animated series at least twice and connected it to his vision of Star Wars, even referencing a Season 6 episode. As explained in the Clone Wars episode Voices, Qui-Gon Jinn spent time with 5 Force priestesses on their planet, the Wellspring of Life. They explained to him how he could keep his persona when he died and joined the Cosmic Force. Yeah, but Maul's very old and we have 2 versions of him. One is with a set of cybernetic legs like the Spider, and then later on he has metal legs and he was a little bit bigger, more of a superhero. We did all this in the animated series. He was in a bunch of episodes. Why would he reference it if it was just Dave's show, not something George really counted? He referenced it because he counted it as canon. And notice this is telling. When he dives into his words about the sequels, he never once references the EU like he does with TCW. Never something like, Han and Leia have kids like they do in the books, or Luke establishes the Jedi Order like in the new Jedi Order series. Very telling. In a 2020 interview, Genndy Tartakovsky, creator of the 03 series, said this, it's frustrating that they try to erase it, 03 Clone Wars, from being canon. At first it was canon, and then once George started doing the CW, or the CG version, he wanted to clean the slate, and so they decanonized ours. This is interesting, as Genndy is claiming not only is the 03 or the 08 series overriding the 03 one, which shouldn't be the case if it was all canon, but it was George who wanted to do so. This is especially telling because for those who don't know, Genndy was actually originally asked to come back to do TCW, but he wanted to also do animated movies, and George didn't want to do so, so the deal fell apart, and then Dave Filoni was brought in. Very interesting. George wanted to decanonize the 03 series, the one Clone Wars multimedia project thing I would actually say he had some actual involvement in. In 2023, referring to the inhibitor chips, Sam Witwer said, and by the way, I have it on authority from George Lucas and Dave Filoni that that's exactly what it is. Referring to Karen Traviss and the changes to Mandalorians, he said, so if you're going to take George Lucas and Dave Filoni to task for changing the Mandalorians, well, you have to take Karen Traviss to task for changing one of the most key plot points of the entire saga. And that's not the only thing she changed. She went in her own direction on a lot of things. So if Karen Traviss could do it, so can George Lucas and Dave Filoni. I think it says it all. And one last quote, Hayden, who returned to play a Clone Wars era Anakin in the Ahsoka show, said, George was telling me about the Clone Wars when we were getting ready to do Revenge of the Sith, just filling me in on all the backstory, how Anakin fought in the Clone Wars, and he was this great warrior and a decorated general. I remember thinking, wow, that sounds really cool. Would be nice to see some of that. Even from Hayden itself, it sounds like George described the Clone Wars era Anakin as something different from what Hayden was doing, and that was before they filmed Revenge of the Sith. Below is an image of George in the writer's room for TCW, and there's the presence of a published book on the table with imagery from a 2010 episode of Clone Wars, meaning this imply it's a 2010 Mandalorians from the season 2. So this implies this is at least early 2010, if not later. If they were planning season 3 in 2008, this must easily be season 5 they're working on, and the Master's still involved. Here's a bunch of images of George working on TCW, including several writer's room images. I know some people say they feel like the same images are used over and over again, so I made sure to include differing images of the writer's room based off of George's clothing. I included some duplicates, but only because they showed him in different roles. Also worthy of note, Dave Filoni talked often in the behind-the-scenes clips of TCW that in the writer's room, they would consult the EU and then oftentimes, normally at the behest of George, maybe include some of it, but end up going mostly in their own direction. Well, in several of these writer room images, EU reference books can be seen on the table, and the maker himself is there. In fact, one's right in front of him. Perhaps there actually is some truth to Filoni's words after all. Here are two images showing George working with Kevin Kiner, who was a composer on TCW. The featurette, a new score from the behind the scenes of the film, has Kevin talking about his first time meeting with George, as well as their work together on the Clone Wars. In April 2020, the Star Wars show aired a clip where co-host David Collins interviewed George and Dave about TCW at Big Rock Ranch. While the time period is not specified, with the only thing being mentioned was when David said it was a little while ago, Dave brings up the Clone Wars having been on Netflix and getting more attention once having been on the platform, so I would say it's some point between 2015 and 2019. While I only took specific moments that were overall relevant to the video topic, the 10-minute interview is available online and I highly recommend people check it out. So, David, what was it that inspired you to move Star Wars into weekly television animated series, and what was it you really wanted to achieve? George, well, I've always been interested in animation and everything, so it seemed like a natural to explore the Clone Wars because we just barely touched on them in the movie. And I thought there were a lot of stories that would be very interesting and could sustain itself for a TV series. I wanted to ask you if you had any recollections of what your first impressions of Dave Filoni is. I'm sure everyone here who works with Dave would love to hear it if you can recall. George, I can't. I'm an old man now. I must have liked him because he got hired. David, you two worked together so closely for so many years on the Clone Wars. This is something George nor Dave never refute. And on top of that, George clearly once again owns TCW and says nothing bad about Dave, or contrary to that narrative that is officially given. David, I wanted to ask you about the medium of television versus a feature film, and do you find it more challenging with Star Wars doing a weekly series, or is it somehow more forgiving in terms of longer character arcs or more episodes? George says, there's nothing forgiving. We weren't making this for television. We were making it for the big screen. I said, think of this as a feature. Everything about it, the style, attention to detail, the lighting, everything is done at a feature level. Even though it's going on television, being young and impressionable, you said, well, you can't do that. Dave, did I say that? Would I say that? I would just... George, how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? That's impossible. Especially after we cut that sequence. It was like about 600 shots more than what they had in the first place, and you did it. As you go through that, eventually you get the hang of it, and then you don't say that. But I always keep them on their toes. I always say, here, that was hard. Here's something that's even worse. Here, George is again detailing the process and claiming involvement, as well as a guiding hand throughout the whole thing. Isn't it funny too? Because George says Dave would always say they can't do it. In the video, Dave pushed back in jest, not seriously. And George would tell him to push through and get it done. Dave talked about that several times in the TCW featurettes. Dave, when I got there, I was the animation director that did storyboards. And then in the second week of working, you said, we're not doing storyboards. Dave, right in front of George, says that it was George who told them they're going to do a different and abnormal process for producing TCW. It wasn't Dave's call. Also worthy to note is that at 3 points in this brief interview, George owns the stories from 3 separate arcs. He owns the Zillow Beast arc in Season 2, the Droids arc in Season 5, and the Banky Clan arc, originally intended for Season 5 but pushed back to Season 6. These are all arcs Dave previously attributed to George and TCW featurettes. And here's a clip I found online from the Blu-ray release of the complete saga where George discusses the inner workings of the Force of the team. Based off of the featurette for the Mortis arc, this seemed to be tied together. But let's talk about some more goodies. Let's talk about Clone Wars Conversations. Clone Wars Conversations was a 2016 online show done by James Arnold Taylor, the animated and video game voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi since the time of Episode 1. He brought on Clone Wars co-stars and they discussed their time on the show. The final episode aired over a year before TCW was announced to be returning publicly, and on a side note, the cast didn't find out until around the time of the recording of the final episode of Rebels that the show was coming back, according to Ashley Eckstein, voice of Ahsoka Tano, and according to Tia Sakar, voice of Sabine on Rebels, who was the only one who knew the ending of the epilogue of the show since she narrated it. The recording for the final episode was about a year before it aired in spring 2018, so James Arnold Taylor doing this show had nothing to do with the Clone Wars coming back. Let's begin. I put the questions in the words of host James Arnold Taylor in bold and his guest for the episode in regular font. In episode 3 of with Ben Diskin, James Arnold Taylor said, referring to his character Whack 47, the pit droid from season 5, at first you look at this character and you go, oh, it's going to be this kind of bumbling, almost Jar Jar-like kind of thing that George Lucas has a great way of creating these characters that you think are going to be that. Referring to season 4, episode 20, Ben Diskin said, so Boba was going to be in this, he's taken prisoner, and the original note from George, I hope I could say this, was they were going to put him in a dress, and Dave Filoni actually had to talk him out of that. Again, detailing George's involvement in the show, even as late as seasons 4 and 5, with Andrew Kishino in episode 4, James Arnold Taylor said, one of the coolest things about Clone Wars was not just that it was the last Star Wars made by George Lucas, but it introduced us to so many wonderful characters. This next one is an exchange between James Arnold Taylor and Sam Witwer, who voiced Maul on the show and did work with Lucasfilm on The Force Unleashed. The return of Darth Maul could only have happened in Clone Wars, in my opinion, and thanks to the brilliant mind of George Lucas, the unbound supervision of Dave Filoni, and the technical geniuses at Lucas Animation. Initially referring to Dave Filoni, but in working so close with George Lucas, I was just going to say, yeah, see, that's one of the things about Clone Wars, is that it being the last George Lucas produced Star Wars, there's a significance there. You'd come back for pickups, yeah, George changed the line to this, or he wanted you to do it more like this. I remember being on vacation once and getting a call from Dave, and he goes, hey, I just wanted you to know I just came out of a meeting. George called your performance gold and called it out in front of everyone. He called that performance gold. When I first started it, it wasn't totally clear to me how involved George Lucas was. So as things like that kept happening, or as I would visit Lucasfilm more and more, I started realizing I'm like, oh, this is significant. And Dave will tell you himself, he's like, oh, the stories come from George. Yeah, sure, Dave had a hand, here's how we're going to do it, blah, 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 blah. But the stories themselves these are George Lucas stories that he wants to get across. Jet Lucas said something to me really fun, yeah, which was I just thought this was it completely confirmed everything that I thought about what was happening in Clone Wars. Jet Lucas said to me, George's kid, yes, who's an awesome guy, by the way, he's so cool. Jet said to me, he goes, one of the reasons why Clone Wars is brilliant is because Clone Wars is Star Wars made by a guy who's sick of Star Wars, referring to his dad, right? And that's why it's brilliant. And you go, yeah, because George never tried to retrace the steps or rehash something he did. He was always pushing it out in different areas where Star Wars hadn't been yet. Yes, and that's what was so exciting about watching Clone Wars week after week, is you never knew that was never the same thing. Never the same thing. It was brilliant. Yeah, that's the brilliance of him. That was Jed Lucas's words right there. This is the first time we heard from George Lucas as to what the Force, it really kind of came from in such that way. Everybody saw George, what his vision was, yeah, and whether or not they knew it was George Lucas, it was George Lucas. It was his vision, and I think that's the most important thing for people to see that. There is a lot to unpack here. First off, if we're going to say Force Unleashed had George's involvement, which we'll address later in the video, well, Sam was there, and he knows how all that works, so he's clearly expressing similar thoughts here. Random small voice actors weighing in is one thing, Sam Witwer is another. Sam is also detailing some of this stuff came directly from George. Now, some might be quick to refute this and point out that some of these quotes were from Dave about George, not specifically straight from George. This is true. However, if you want to try and make the claim that Dave Filoni can't be trusted, well, I don't see how that can apply here. Sure, you could make the argument that Dave Filoni would lie at a Comic-Con interview or on TCW BTS featurettes because those were going to be made public and he knew that. But these are personal conversations he had with cast and crew that are only being revealed years later on his random web show that Dave had no idea was going to happen. I think considering James Arnold Taylor stopped doing this show around the same time that he presumably found out about TCW coming back, even though there were stars like Ashley Eckstein and Dee Baker that he said he would invite on, but he never ended up doing so. It shows that he only did this as a little project to reminisce about TCW. It wasn't Dave who told him to do it, and if anything, Dave might have told him to stop as they prepared for season 7. So again, these are personal behind the scenes conversations that Dave had with crew. Why would he lie? He didn't know they were becoming public. Why call Sam and tell him George said in a meeting that he liked his performance if George never really said that? I think these quotes can all be treated as valid. But let's talk about that little blurb he gives about Jet Lucas and George. I've seen some people say this and use it to try and say that George hated Star Wars. First off, that's a lie, and we'll address it shortly. Second off, even if that's true, that's still George's son saying he made TCW. Third, it just clearly is not what this means, and anyone who tries to say that is taking it out of context. Jet is clearly telling Sam George hates repeating himself. He doesn't want to do the same thing over and over again. He wants to try something new every time. Jet is clearly telling Sam that George doesn't want to remake Star Wars that we've already seen. He wants to make something new, and that's why TCW is good. It's just like how the first thing George reportedly said after seeing Force Awakens was, "There's nothing new." All this exchange between Jet and Sam means is George tried something new each arc, and that's why they think TCW is great. Also, unless you're calling Sam Witwer a liar, this is George's son basically saying George is the one making TCW, not Dave or anyone else. Now then, let's move on. In a specific conversation with Jason Spizak, referring to auditions, James Arnold Taylor said, Dave was very specific. I mean, he was every audition, and he always made sure that it was within his, but also George Lucas listens to these and the whole crew there. That's what's always blown my mind. Again, George Lucas was involved. Now let's get to a doozy. Matt Lanter. Now, Matt Lanter, for those who don't know, is the voice of Anakin Skywalker. And I was surprised what I heard watching this one. Referring to the beginning of Clone Wars production, so you get to do something that was kind of unique to the cast. You sit down in George Lucas's office and have a little conversation with him before. So did you also then sit down with Dave Filoni in that office in that meeting, or was it just you and George? In that particular meeting, Dave escorted me. We were at the main house where George's office was. Dave escorted me up there, and I think he just left me and George sitting there, just like a friendly, fun chat. I walked in, and George goes, "Anakin." We believed it was Anakin, but you weren't doing anything reflective of what anybody else had done before. No, and when I went to the ranch and talked to George, he gave me a couple of specific notes, and, I don't know if I've said them before or not, but I'll keep those notes to myself. But sure, it was very much on purpose to not do what we have traditionally known as Anakin, yeah. And I think that was obviously George's vision and Dave's vision to shape the character a little differently in the Clone Wars and give Anakin a little more in depth than what we got to see on the, 4 hours of the movie screen. We had 4 hours to connect with Anakin, and it's hard because, first of all, he goes in this downward spiral from good to the worst villain in the galaxy in the course of like 2 hours. And prior to that, a lot of people, I've heard that he's whiny, and so it just wasn't enough time to take a guy from teenage angst into the worst villain. We needed more, and I think George and Dave understood that and understood that we got to connect to the character more. Talking about his audition, he said, about 3 days later, after I got the call that it's Star Wars and it's Anakin, he's a lead of the show. George Lucas loved the sound. The thing I loved about it is this was George's last stuff. A lot to unpack here. If there was still any doubt about Anakin as portrayed in TCW coming from George, well, here's the proof. George had a personal sit down with Matt Lanter, gave him some notes, and then told him they didn't want to do Anakin's portrayal the exact same way it was shown in the films. What's interesting is the way Matt Lanter describes it, it wasn't seen to them as changing, but it was flushing out. Matt Lanter says he isn't saying Anakin was whining and that's what was so bad and we needed to turn tail and run from that. He's saying we had essentially 4 hours of the film to watch Anakin go from good to pure evil, and that's not a lot of time to take what we saw in Attack of the Clones and turn him into Darth Vader. So they used TCW to flush that out and build upon it. Notice also how it was George Lucas who personally loved the sound of Matt's voice as Anakin. It all came from George. George was involved, and if he wasn't too bothered with TCW, then I ask, why did he personally sit down with the Anakin voice actor before the show's production started to go over notes from some things and give him some notes? From episode 10 with Angelic Perrin, first of all, Mr. Lucas at that time was going through every script, referring to different name pronunciations. I think that all stems from George Lucas saying, just like, I've mentioned this before on these, like somebody may say Adi Galia, uh, and somebody may say Adi Galia. Here we go, well, that's real life, so keep it in. Referring to Adi Galia's story in TCW and her fate, it also shows, I think, Dave and George Lucas's love for the character and really uh, in reverence if you look back as to how what they did with her character. All I know is when George Lucas said, "Hey, I want you in this," I was like, "Okay, what time?" Again, George Lucas was involved. In the interview with Phil Lamar, James Arnold Taylor said, "I also credit that to the fact that he was working daily with George Lucas." The next couple episodes were a little different. Instead of James Arnold Taylor hosting, Amy Ratcliffe, a writer at StarWars.com, stepped in to play host while James Arnold Taylor was interviewed, and he had a lot to say. Even George Lucas gave us this freedom as a cast, talking about the difference in Matt and Hayden's voices as opposed to Ewan and James. And again, credit to George Lucas and Dave Filoni and the people there that went, no, we just want to make these characters. It was pretty special. It was one of the most special moments at times of my life, of my career. One of the best shows I could work on because of the cast and because of the freedom that George gave us all. You know, it's like people go, well, how do you say this character's name? George was always like, well, however you say it is how you say it. People not seeing the power of Clone Wars initially, you know, Disney not even seeing the power of Clone Wars initially, and George believing in it so much. I'll never forget the first year I hosted Star Wars Weekends, being backstage with Bob Iger, George Lucas, Dave Filoni, Ashley Eckstein, Daniel Logan, Anthony Daniels, and myself. And we're waiting to go on stage, and for about 45 minutes, I'm sitting there this close to George and Bob Iger having a conversation about Clone Wars, and George is telling him all about Clone Wars. James alludes to now knowing why they were talking. Amy suggests George was being a salesman. James responded, but he was like a little kid excited about his new toy, and it was really charming. This event that James Arnold Taylor is referring to was in May 2011, the same day Star Tours 2 opened. And while Clone Wars Season 3 was finished, and Season 4 and 5, and probably even 6 were in production. I feel like Clone Wars was in a lot of ways his baby. Yeah, he was in it, his family was in it, you know, his daughter wrote episodes. Referring to Racco Hardeen, but Carrie Silver and the producer and Dave Filoni, they said George was saying he doesn't want James to play Hardeen because he wants it to be so different. We don't want it to be the same actor. But they went, but we know you could do it. And I'm so thankful to them for doing that. So they had me do Hardeen. They didn't tell George, and then they played and they said, you know, what do you think? And he said, oh yeah, it's good. Who's that? And they said, that's James. But I think in his mind, he was thinking, well, you know, of course you don't want to hear Obi-Wan's voice in Hardeen, and thankfully, I don't think you do. Talking about their reactions to Darth Maul coming back, but if George says, and that was his plan, you know, that's how it was presented to Dave, you know, well, then when we bring Darth Maul back, it's such a wonderful thing that George Lucas had this playground of Clone Wars to end his time making Star Wars. It was Clone Wars, that he got to tell all these stories with all these characters in a way that was acceptable in his canon. You have to give credence to the creator of this, and I always have. If George wants to bring Jar Jar in, if George wants to bring Jar Jar in, if George wants to do this, he's the storyteller, he's the master, he's the storyteller, let him do it. Lots here. But again, I think James makes it very clear. George was very involved in TCW and especially in the stories. Two specific things I wanted to call attention to. The situation about James Arnold Taylor playing Racco Hardeen. This is a good example of what really happened when people said Dave went behind George's back. Dave trusted his gut, had James do the voice, and then they showed it to George, and he liked it and approved it. It wasn't Dave ignoring George, doing his own thing and sending it to air. When Dave had a creative hunch, he listened to it and took it to George for approval when the episode was pretty much done for him to see and sign off on. The second instance is from Star Tours. As James said, George was telling Bob all about TCW and getting very enthusiastic and excited about it. Does that sound like someone who hates Star Wars? Not to me. But let's move on. Let's get into a more controversial subject. Let's talk about Dave Filoni. I know some people have issues with Filoni, and trust me, I'm not someone who wholeheartedly loves him. He's made a lot of mixed bag projects, and I've got a video coming out down the road that rips apart his whole campfire stories logic. I know Dave has been mostly positive about the Disney stuff, but that's a separate issue. We're talking about Dave Filoni as it relates to TCW. Um, Dave Filoni was the supervisor, director, and one of the main showrunners alongside George Lucas. He has a lot to add about the making of the show, as well as the thoughts of George Lucas on the EU. If Dave Filoni is accurate when he talks about George, TCW, and the EU, then it's pretty much irrefutable proof that George did not count the EU as canon. Because of this, EU purists have to address him one way or another, and they tend to do it in a way that lets them write him off so that they can keep to their narrative. So, because of this, as much as I don't want to play Filoni apologetics, we need to examine this and clear Filoni's name, at least as far as it relates to TCW and pre Disney actions, as his post Disney stuff isn't really relevant. Dave has been pandered many things by EU purists. As someone who pilfers the EU, someone who does things behind George's back, someone who isn't even a fan of Star Wars, someone who hates the prequels and made certain choices to align those films with the OT, someone who is a creative hack who has no respect for continuity, hides behind George's name when he does something controversial, takes credit for all the good stuff, and above all, is a liar. Note the circular logic, though, a lot of EU purists will use when referring to Dave as a liar. Anytime he says something that goes against their narrative, such as saying certain EU retcons like Mandalore or Koth being alive come from George, they'll say he's lying. But anytime he says something that fits their narrative, such as when he praises a Disney project, they'll say he's telling the truth. And the best part is, as we've said, Dave was the supervising director on TCW. Most of what we know about the show's development and inner workings come from him. Isn't that pretty convenient for EU purists that they can slam the main day-to-day showrunner as a liar and ignore everything he says that they don't like? But whenever he says something they can use to support their narrative, then actually it's okay because in that instance he's telling the truth? First off, even if he did lie about something, that doesn't mean everything he has ever said is a lie. Most people have told a few lies in their life. I know I have. But that doesn't mean all of us are egotistical liars. Second off, even if he was an egotistical liar, then he wouldn't be open and honest about some of the stuff he's done. In the instance of that Clone Wars episode, Wrong Jedi, that gets brought up a lot, where he hid something from George, if he was a conniving and deceitful liar, he wouldn't openly admit that for crew and audience alike to see. That instance gets taken out of context. Basics of what happened was there was something he wanted in an episode. He thought George would like it in final form, but not in its rough version. So he didn't show George throughout various editing stages and only showed him in the final cut. And George did end up liking it. He still had to show George and get it approved before it went to air, but he never planned to always hide it. Here's the quote. Every episode of The Clone Wars ends the same way, with that ring out. How many times have you been sitting at home watching the show and you get kind of, hopefully if I've done my job right, worked into a nice emotional state and then you're just smacked right out of it by that ring out? For years, I've been trying to get rid of it. Not on every episode, that's fine, but just on certain episodes. I thought this arc was the arc where it had to happen. And I knew it as soon as I read the scripts and as soon as George sat down and we kept the idea. I sat there and I thought to myself secretly, this episode is going to fade out to black. I know George now, and I'm like, there's no way I can sell this to him when we watch it in in a rough cut. It's not going to happen. So when he watched the rough cut for the first time, I didn't put it on there. I knew that to sell this to him right, we needed the lighting, we needed the sky, we needed the full orchestration by Kevin Kiner. So when he watched it in color, that's when we faded out. As you can see, it's not Dave being deceitful about changing George's vision as far as major story beats or character arcs or continuity retcons. It was simply a stylistic choice about fading out to credits over the normal outro for the show. And even then, his plan was to simply put it together like a surprise and sell it to George like a salesman. It was never, I'm going to do this behind his back whether he likes it or not. And notice too how he very briefly mentions George and him collectively keeping the idea of Ahsoka leaving the Order. If we're trusting Dave Filoni's recounting of this story to hold it against him, then we must also acknowledge that George was on board with what happens to Ahsoka at the end of Season 5. But see the poor logic of the Filoni haters here. They'll probably ignore that, but they'll say otherwise in this instance it's true, everything that he said, and that he's not lying here. It just doesn't make sense, and it's simply a way Filoni haters and EU purists use to use convenient and contradicting logic to ignore Filoni when it suits their narrative, and use Filoni only when it benefits the story they're trying to sell you about the so-called truth. Another instance of Dave doing something behind George's back that C brought up a lot is keeping Ahsoka alive. People seem to have this idea that George told Dave to kill off Ahsoka and he refused. But that's not how that happened. Keep in mind, the only source we have for any of this information and George's thoughts on Ahsoka's fate is Dave Filoni anyway. But in the featurette for Season 5, Episode 20, Dave says the original plan was to bring Ahsoka back into the Order at the end of Season 5. But George was always in the Ahsoka dies camp, and Dave was in the Ahsoka lives camp. And Dave saw an opportunity to leave her out of the Jedi Order and tell an interesting story. And he shared this with George and the other writers, personally hoping that if Ahsoka never rejoined the Order, it would be one step closer to her not dying. This was something that in the original discussion for the episode, we were just going to have her brought back under the Jedi at the end and be done with it. But I thought, wait, we have an opportunity here to do something different. I don't think it's a mystery that I've always been a bit more in the Ahsoka lives camp, and George has been very full on in the Ahsoka dies camp. I think I've said that before, if not revelation for you. So I thought expelling her from the Jedi Order is a good movement towards that end, and we stand on that bold new frontier for her, things have changed. Keep in mind, too, that the show was planned for 8 seasons. This very well could have eventually killed her off. There was still plenty of time, and when season 5 went into production beyond the story stage, as we've already shown, George was still around. And as we just talked about, George was okay with keeping this idea and story suggestion of her leaving the Order. Well, yes, Ahsoka has survived the Clone Wars and is now starring in stories in the post-Return of the Jedi universe that is post-Disney acquisition and irrelevant to the discussion on TCW and how it relates to George. I've also seen some suggest that Dave really did throw out George's plans and for continuity and in what appears to be a public admission of taking ownership of TCW. It was at a public event where he was given an action figure of himself, speaking to it like a ventriloquist would speak to a dummy. The quote exchange is, "Do you think Ahsoka's going to live through Clone Wars, or am I going to change the continuity?" Dave, it's your show! Oh, that's true, I could do that, couldn't I? The truth is, this was nothing more than a joke, and it's irrelevant to the discussion. This was for Star Wars Celebration 2019, during the panel Rebels Remembered. Ahsoka pops up in Star Wars Rebels, and at this time fans were awaiting the 7th season of Clone Wars due that next March. Obviously, Ahsoka lives in TCW, and as she pops up in Rebels, and Dave's saying it's his show because essentially at this point it was. George had been away from the franchise for years. This has nothing to do with TCW's initial production in seasons 1 through 6, and anyone who claims otherwise is being intentionally deceitful, as the only way to view this clip is with the celebration headlines on the bottom mentioning the panel name Rebels Remembered. While some believe Dave did his own thing, the truth is he did defer to Lucas whenever they were in disagreement, which wasn't too common of a thing, even if Filoni believes he was right. During the behind the scenes for the Citadel arc, Filoni had this to say. When it came time for the demise of O.C. Sobek, the main villain of the Citadel arc, and the end of the Citadel arc, there were actually 3 different endings. The first one, which was, and probably still is my favorite one, was off the original script in our original outline, which was that it was Tarkin that killed O.C. Sobek after 5 shot Sobek off of his staff and fell to the ground. And Tarkin just walked up while Sobek pleaded for his life and said, "No, I'm unarmed." And Tarkin just bang, shot him dead. It's one of the few times that we really start to twist the Republic into the foreshadowing of the Empire through Tarkin. And I thought this really said that this is the future, this type of brutal people running the Republic. But when George saw the episode, he said that, and I agree. What's problematic about it is that the Jedi witnessed this, and it kind of makes them a bit thick not to realize that this is going to be a really bad thing to have people like Tarkin in control of the military, so I came up with a different ending. Again, Filoni sits here and acknowledges that although the original ending they had was cooler in his opinion, and he liked it more, he accepted George's orders and changed the ending to something that George thought made more sense, something that Filoni attributed credit to George for pointing out. This was really Dave's show, then Tarkin would have shot O.C. Sobek. And while some might try and twist this to say that George must not be too involved, otherwise he should have caught it, I disagree. Dave simply says George pointed this out, and when he saw the final cut of the episode, it's one thing to read on paper. Tarkin shoots OC Sobek, but sometimes taking things in visually helps point out a flaw even better than on paper. After all, George is a visual guy, which is why he read some EU comics but never any novels. I've personally found myself noticing errors visually that I miss on paper, so George not pointing this out until final cut screening has no bearing on his story involvement. Perhaps the most common example I've seen is of Dave Filoni being called a liar is from the season 4 featurette on Darth Maul, where EU purists claim Dave tried to take credit for creating Maul's legs designs that actually came from an EU comic, only to be called out by Katie Lucas. First off, don't let them fool you. These EU purists will also attack Katie Lucas, George Lucas's daughter, for her other work on the show regarding Ventress. Below is a transcript of the scene where this featurette, and it can be found online by anyone who wishes. The context is they are watching the scene where Maul is reassembled by Mother Talzin in season 4, episode 22. Initially, he's got those spider legs, and then they give him the kind of General Grievous looking legs. So here's the full exchange. Sam Witwer. This idea with the cables shooting out and then the pieces flying out of the battle droids and all that was from George? Dave. Well, yeah, how he made the legs in the original version, it was that they scavenged battle droids that they were laying around the battle, and then I thought, well, we actually, I hate to say this, I hate to bring it up, but we got those legs from the EU. Yeah, absolutely. We did. Yeah. We brought up an image of the chicken legs and we thought, you know what? That's established. And, they were too good looking. They were too well. We wanted to witch them up a bit. And that was the big thing. That was, I thought, the only way to really believe that he comes back is if you add this element of magic. And so it's a combination. Originally, we had the shot and there were no cables or metal involved at all. And she formed it like she formed Savage's spear, just out of thin air. But then George said, he wanted more logic to it, so Joel did this great effect where you actually see the fusing of the metal and the magic burning. I genuinely don't understand how someone sees this as him lying or trying to take credit for the leg design. They were talking about the whole magical aspect of it, and then Katie brought up how the design was from an out of universe perspective from the EU. Dave immediately agreed, and then redirected the conversation back to the magical element from the Night Sisters, which is what Sam Witwer asked to begin with. He wasn't asking, so these legs, did George come up with that, or you, or what? Leading Dave to respond, well, that was me, until Katie Lucas confronts him. Sam was asking, hey, this visual of all the wires and the damaged droids and magic telekinesis being put on Maul, that was George's idea? To which Dave said, well, yeah, that's how the legs are getting made, but in the original idea, it was simply, instead of magic, they were grabbing pieces by hand and making them, to which Katie says, well, we pulled the design from the EU. Dave responds, well, yeah, absolutely, duh. Anyway, we wanted to witch it up a bit and add some magical elements, and then also some logic, because this is basically a character resurrection, so we wanted to spice it up a little, but keep it grounded. Originally, the pieces just kind of formed out of thin air, then George said do the cable thing. I honestly don't know how anyone could see this as Filoni trying to steal credit for the legs design from the EU. To me, it seems Katie Lucas simply misunderstood the question from Sam, and her answer spurred controversy. I'm not saying this is her fault, it's the poor interpretation of others who see this and misconstrue it, but I think if Katie hadn't said anything, then this wouldn't have been a controversial exchange at all. Right in line with this, though, EU purists will claim Dave steals from the EU or he lies when he and other crew members say in various behind the scenes features that a particular element of their story is new for Star Wars, or something along those lines, even though it happened in the EU already. First off, as we already showed, George kind of did this too to a degree, and so if you indict Dave, then you need to indict George. But I found another exchange that's interesting. In one of the season 1 featurettes, Dave said this. In the comic books, they had experimented with developing a virus killing Gungans. There had been a Karen Travis novel, Republic Commandos, where the Separatists were developing a biological weapon. So using those stories that had existed in the Star Wars expanded universe, as a way of saying there are cases where this had already happened, and this is the Clone Wars version of that type of warfare, which is new to the larger Star Wars audience. I think this is pretty telling of what they really mean when they say it's the first time something they did on the show appeared in Star Wars. Dave has also spoken several times that George has told them the EU doesn't really count and only the films and TCW matter. Whether you choose to believe that did come from George or not, it's clearly the mentality Filoni had on the show. So when he says this is the first time something is in Star Wars, even if it's been in the EU, he's not discounting the EU. After all, he brings it up and certain elements up in the show BTS featurettes often. He's merely saying it in the context of what the larger audience considers Star Wars and what he and Lucas consider Star Wars, which is the on-screen stuff. Which, technically speaking, yeah, TCW did a lot of stuff that was brand new to on-screen Star Wars, whether it already happened in the publishing EU or not. Along these same lines, another example I've seen brought up is that Dave took the Slaves of the Republic comics from a former TCW writer and basically stole his story and butchered it and put it in season 4. But if you watch the BTS on the DVD for that arc, which is also available online, the original writer of the comic, Henry Gilroy, was brought in to help work on that arc with the other season 4 crew. Dave has also been accused of giving credit for controversial stuff like Maul or Jango and Boba with the Mandalorians, etc., to George, while taking credit for the quote unquote good stuff. And that's not always true. First off, the decision to bring back Maul has generally been speaking looked at in a positive light, except for people who were already predisposed to dislike the show. And he gave George credit for that. While it may have been somewhat controversial at first, by 2020 it was looked at way more favorably. And in Season 1, Episode 2 of The Mandalorian Gallery, during its infamous Duel of the Fates monologue, he again credits George for bringing Maul back instead of taking credit for a now popular decision. As for making Jango Fett and Boba Fett not Mandalorians, he knew that was controversial, and he said that came from George. And if he was lying and it really came from Dave, then why did Dave and Jon Favreau reverse that decision and retcon that in Season 2, Episode 6 of Mandalorian, making Boba Fett a Mandalorian again? The only way that makes sense is George wanted them to not be Mandalorians. Dave didn't like that, but had to listen since George was in charge. And then when George was no longer around, Dave was able to change that to fit with the EU and previous conceptions of the Fets. There are also many times where Dave has praised George or given George credit. He said on Twitter in 2022, "None of us could beat George. Star Wars is unique to him, but now it's our job to take care of it." He also said in 2008, George is just a really good guy, and meeting him has been great, and working for him has been great. And then he also said, and I'll clearly say, because of his vision to use ZViz as part of our production, I am a significantly better filmmaker. At the Lucasfilm animation panel in Star Wars Celebration 2025, Dave took a moment to praise George and talk about how much of an influence George was on Dave and how much he misses working for him, to the point of even getting a little teary-eyed.
And one of the reasons why we did the Bad Batch too was that George, that was one of the ideas that he had when we were still working together, was let's do a Bad Batch spin-off and continue with the clones that way. And so, I loved working with George, and I always try to honor that, what he wanted. It's important to me.
Give it up for George Lucas.
Dave spends the entirety of the TCW Season 2 featurette for Landing at Point Rain talking about how George basically had them restart and recut the entire episode. And he gives props on the episode coming out the way it did to George's guidance and the crew for pulling it off in a timely manner, taking no credit for himself and even at one point talking in awe at what George was doing. It's a 2.5 minute featurette, by the way, if you wanted to check it out. It's not like 30 minutes. And this was something that also came up in the years following and even got brought up in Star Wars Celebration 2025, where Dave and the other TCW crew member with him, Athena Portillo, both had nothing but praise for George regarding the situation, taking credit for none of it, despite the fact that the episode in question was a high-rated episode for the show. Another instance was in the BTS for Season 2, Episode 3, when referring to Mustafar being in TCW. Dave said, Mustafar was also a big deal for me because I argued with George about that. It's really Mustafar because, that's where the whole thing with Vader happens at the end, and Anakin, should he really be there? You find your fan self clashing with the story that George wants to tell because we hold everything, so precious to me and nobody can know about Mustafar. Well, it's a mining planet. They probably have a business. I'm sure things are exported off Mustafar. We take it to such an uber serious level, and it always takes George to, snap you out of that sometimes and say, but this is a great ending to this trilogy. Don't get so hung up on that. Dave has also been praised by other people working on the show, including George. When I came to Catherine Winder said when I came to Lucasfilm, I was a fan of Star Wars, but not an uber fan like Dave and some of the other people that came on after. I mean, keep in mind, Dave cosplayed as Plo Koon prior to joining on the TCW team. Ben Diskin, an actor, said Dave is, as you know, a fountain of Star Wars knowledge and trivia, the likes of which I've never seen. And referring to Dave Filoni while patting him on the back at Celebration 2017, George said, "This is one of my kids. This is one of my kids." Why would George call Dave one of his kids if Dave was some spiteful creative hack who spent the better part of 10 years undermining George's story and vision, stabbing him in the back and betraying him? Some will still allege that Dave betrayed the trust of Star Wars and George Lucas and retconned the EU, and that even though Dave and numerous others have claimed that the EU was separate and per George he was allowed to ignore it, EU purists believe that in actuality, Dave was instructed to follow the EU. Quote I've seen some used to support that idea is this one from Catherine Winder. We'd have big milestone meetings with Dave, myself, him, and whoever the artist was for whatever we were working on, and he'd give us notes and thoughts, dot, dot, dot. He trusted Dave in terms of knowing the characters, being true to the universe, and taking care of continuity issues with vehicles and planets and that sort of thing. He didn't really need to get involved from that point of view. This was a quote from a NBT article that has since vanished from the internet since MTV purged their news articles. I believe the quote did exist, but the context surrounding it is now gone. On top of that, there is an ellipses right in the middle of the quote, so I don't know if this was just an in-person interview where she trailed off, or if the ellipses was used to cut out information. And if that's the case, that could be crucial context being left out. But let's take this at face value as currently presented. I think it's been made pretty clear from other sources, including George Lucas himself, that George didn't count the EU. Therefore, this is not referencing the continuity of the EU, but the continuity of the films and the world of the films, especially since George himself was not necessarily true to these with the prequel trilogy. On top of that, we've established the problem of Ahsoka Tano and George being part of the character's creation, aware of her existence and the problem she represents for the EU and the Clone Wars multimedia project. Considering he allowed Ahsoka, I can't, in good conscience, believe this idea of being true to the universe and characters is anything other than a reference to the films and not to the EU. After all, in May 2007, Catherine and Dave held a TCW panel. While I cannot locate a transcript or video of the panel, a takeaway from a website that had access stated this. While continuity is being taken very seriously by the creators of the series, Lucas retains the right to make slight adjustments for the sake of the story. Filoni is extremely well versed in Star Wars mythology and expanding universe, so rest assured is in very good hands. It's also worth noting that Catherine Winder departed at some point in 2009, so she wasn't there for the rest of the show's development. Also, as a fun side note, EU purists love to make fun of the clip of Dave where he says, people get into all these debates of what's canon and what's not, and sometimes forget just the special nature of telling a good story and creating great characters. It's funny because Catherine Winder, who they're trying to say, said to follow the EU, said something similar, yet they'll still take her words as a valid interpretation about upholding the EU. The canon is the foundation from which we develop the content. We had to respect that. We had to ensure the integrity was intact. The end goal is always telling a great story. I think it's also fair by now to point out that Dave probably wasn't really lying at all about George, and whenever he said directives like stories and continuity decisions came from George, he probably did. Dave often attributed story arcs to coming from George in the BTS featurettes. As I've already mentioned, while having the in-person interview with George, the one from the Star Wars show aired in 2020, Dave attributed at least 3 arcs to George, and George owned the stories of all that. He's also owned all the stuff having to do with Maul, as well as Yoda in Season 6. George has owned Ahsoka as part of the story. Anakin's perceived differences as part of the story. George's daughter wrote several episodes of the show. And in both 2017 at Celebration and in the 2020 interview, Dave and George have both accepted and told the notion that George was involved in the show and its stories on more than a passive level. Several other writers and people who worked on the prequel trilogy have even commented about George's involvement in the stories. Dave probably wasn't lying, and he was probably telling the truth. A lot of the show's stories and controversies? Most likely indeed. come from George. Further supporting that, if Dave was lying about all this, why would George stand for that? If Dave was supposed to be keeping in line with the EU and he wasn't following that guideline, why wouldn't George fire him and replace him? George didn't like Gary Kurtz's job performance on The Empire Strikes Back and fired him from his producer job, which is why someone else produced Return of the Jedi. And George surely knew of the continuity struggles. He would have heard of Karen Travis's explosive departure, and the TCW retcons were the primary reason why she left. I suppose one could make the case that, George wouldn't know every single small and minor retcon made by TCW to the Clone Wars multimedia project, but he surely would have known about the major ones. No way he sees the EU take on Mandalorians as accurate and then has no idea Dave changes that. George is, at the very least, complicit in the EU continuity issues with TCW. And if he's at least complicit, if not responsible, then that presents a major blow for EU purists. Some may say, despite all the evidence, they still insist that George was unaware or not paying attention. But Katie Lucas was also there. Say what you want about George and the internet and keeping up to date with things. Katie Lucas is the next generation. Would she really stand for it if Dave was lying about her death? I think not. After all, we have several instances of George playing an active part in the writer's room where stories were decided. I'm sorry, guys, but the truth is, George was responsible. It wasn't Dave Filoni acting in rebellion against the maker. One question, too, I've seen pop up is, if George really liked Dave, why did he make Kathy his replacement, not Dave? I think the answer is very simple. Kathy had 30 years of experience producing movies. A producer on movies deals with similar things that the president of Lucasfilm would be dealing with. Dave, on the other hand, was young and basically had been an animation director. Dave simply wasn't ready yet. Kathy was a smarter choice, at least at the time. Hindsight? Yeah, and that might say otherwise. But enough of the positive case. Let's switch tactics and play some defense for a bit as we address possible rebuttals or opposing claims and quotes to the case I've presented. Some will still insist George was not too heavily involved or TCW did not come from him, especially since he was never credited as a writer. Dave described the writer's room process, something others like Rob Coleman would have pointed out. When we do the writer's meeting, all the writers together, with George and myself, we beat out an outline for how the story's going to flow, and then it's up to the writer to expand that and make it all fleshed out. It's true. George wrote the scripts for 0 episodes of the show. But guess what? Dave only wrote 1 script prior to season 7. So if this is a metric we're using to invalidate George, then we also get to invalidate Dave. And as I pointed out, while there was still oversight from George, as there was in TCW, George didn't write the scripts for 2 of the 6 movies that we attribute to him, so this shouldn't be a determining factor. The fact that George didn't write the full-on script for each episode has no bearing on whether George pitched or fleshed out the story for the said writer or if he approved it afterwards. Some will insist that TCW wasn't George's because he didn't direct any episodes. When asked if he would like to see George Lucas direct an episode, Dave Filoni said in Star Wars Insider 128, "Oh wow, that would be something." It has briefly come up in the past, with George, I would never say anything is out of bounds. If George came in and said, "Dave, I want to direct an episode," I'm not going to say, "Well, I'll see if I could fit you in." Dave only directed 9 episodes prior to season 7. Directing is different in television versus films. Directors guide the shooting of a specific episode on the TV show, but there are still overall showrunners that run the entire production, of which George and Dave function as. On top of that, if we're going to make this claim that because George didn't write any of the episode scripts or direct any episodes, that TCW didn't belong to him, well, guess what? Young Indiana Jones is a show that often is heavily attributed to George. And guess what? He didn't write or direct a single episode, but the show is attributed to him because he was heavily involved in the stories of each episode, as well as he was the executive producer of the show, just like he was with TCW. Some will say he's only credited as an executive producer, and that was as a courtesy credit, and that doesn't mean much. But his only credit on the Clone Wars 03 series is an executive producer. Executive producers on shows function much more similar to a director on a movie than an executive producer on a movie. It is a high-level role that oversees the entire production process, often with a significant financial or creative stake. As we saw in some of the quotes we went over earlier, like a couple from Catherine Winder, George was absolutely very involved in things an executive producer would be involved in. Some will insist that there are several quotes throughout the decade of TCW production that show TCW wasn't really George's or that he wasn't really involved, such as this one from MTV. The epic itself is basically about one man. You pass through a lot of things, but you never get to look at it. With Clone Wars, we're not burdened by the mythological underpinnings. We get to go more places. The story about Anakin Skywalker and his fall into the dark side and redemption by his son, it's finished. It was started when he was 10. It ends when he died. There's no more story to tell. All that stuff is not really part of what this is. Stylistically and tonally, however, the film almost takes place in an entirely separate universe. Keep in mind, Dave Filoni and George gave this interview jointly together. This is not a question-answer interview as laid out in the article online. The only context we were given ahead of time is this. He's pretty much the undisputed star of 6 feature films, a pod-racing Jedi protege who grows up to become the most evil Sith Lord in the universe. So how do you have some real fun in the Star Wars sandbox? Get little orphan Annie the heck out of the way, that's how. Star Wars creator George Lucas laughed Monday from his Big Rock Ranch. The series' first foray into feature animation, Star Wars The Clone Wars aims to do exactly that, despite the fact that Anakin Skywalker is featured prominently in the poster for the film, and at least initially is something of a major character. In the end, the movie, and by extension the 100-episode TV show for which it serves as a prologue, is not a Skywalker story, Lucas insisted. What Lucas seems to be saying is TCW is not part of the grand mythical epic of episodes 1 through 6, but a side story. It is not important to understand the story of 1 through 6. We've already discussed a similar quote to this. It's similar to the Disney anthology films or the EU novels. As for it being in a separate universe, he said almost. The usage of this word deliberately implies that while it feels separate, it absolutely is not. I've seen some try to take this quote and say any using the Starlock quote to decanonize the EU must also apply the same logic to TCW based off of this quote. That's not exactly true. We've already addressed the Starlock quote, and I'll address it more in a bit. But one key difference is whenever he talks about the EU, he's always said something along the lines of it being in a different world. He's never said anything short of that. With TCW, he said it's almost like. If he used the word almost with the EU, then maybe you'd have a case. But since he used the word almost with TCW and not the EU, I think that not only shows these two quotes are different, but that he again saw TCW differently than the EU. Another quote from Lucas I've seen used. No, I mean, I'm just doing it for fun now. I'm an executive producer. Now, I don't do the day-to-day work. I check in once a week maybe, and it'll be the same thing on the live-action show. I'm also producing Red Tails, his long-in-the-works project about World War II Tuskegee Airmen. I'm producing all these things now, and then hopefully in a year or two I'll be completely removed, and I'll just be able to go off and do my own movies again. Question asked, do you see any end to working on Star Wars? He is still involved, just not doing day-to-day work like recording animation, etc. He says he's still producing it, though, in addition to Red Tails. And he makes no distinction between the projects and his role, yet EU purists still attribute Red Tails to him. Also, as we've already shown, George doesn't need to be there every single day to have it be his project. We've already shown that him creating the stories and approving the final form did not require everyday involvement. And even with The Empire Strikes Back, he wasn't on set all the time. He was there a lot, but not every day. Even Indiana Jones, he wasn't there all the time. So does that mean George wasn't involved with Indy and it's not his story? One I've seen used a lot is this one from a BBC interview. When asked if he feels a sense of loss now that the 6 episodes are over, he says, no, it's more like having your kids go off to college. They still come back when they need money and they'll be there for the holidays. We're doing a couple of TV series, but I'm not really involved with it. One is an animated series about the Clone Wars. All the other characters are in it, but obviously there's not much character arc. And one is a live-action series about minor characters in the saga. So it's still going to be around. I'm going to go off and do my thing. The company is going to go off and do theirs. But the comic books, novels, and games that are out there are going to have a life of their own. So it's sort of like sending the kids off to college. Now it's on its own, doing its own thing. I just reserved the theatrical arena for the saga, which, as I say, started out as a 2-hour idea and turned into 12 hours of story. What people using this quote don't tell you is that this interview is in May 2005. Revenge of the Sith was just about to come out. This was a few days before the film came out. George was focused on that. Catherine Winder stated she was the one who found Dave and brought him to interview with George. It wasn't George himself who found him. These events also happened about a week or two before Revenge of the Sith released, further proving the point. But clearly, as time went on, George got more involved, and even Dave Filoni himself said that. This quote is a nothing burger. I've seen a lot of people use it, but never anyone use it with the disclaimer of the year and month it was given. On a Collider interview, George was asked, "Where's the live action one going to fit into the overall narrative?" George responded, "It's completely separate. This one has all the characters that everybody knows. Everybody from Yoda to Anakin to Mace Windu to Obi-Wan, everybody's there. The live action has nobody there because it's after episode 3, so everybody's dead basically or hiding somewhere. You hear about the Emperor just like you do in episode 4, but it's mostly about a whole different world. I mean, there are a million stories in the big city. You've only seen one of them." In this context, he's mainly talking about the live action show, not TCW, but I saw someone bring it up to show his usage of the word world and separate. Again, based off of the context here, separate and world are simply referring to the fact that it will be new characters because the film characters are elsewhere, whereas for TCW, it has the film characters. The way he uses world and separate in this context is not universal. The context for when he uses it to refer to the EU is most times different. Also, he clearly implies that TCW is not separate like the live action series because of the film characters' presence. The film characters are heavily present in a lot of the EU material, yet George still called that separate. If anything, I think this quote does more harm to the EU equals George narrative than to help it. Another one I've seen used is this quote from Dave Filoni and his thoughts on George's retirement. To us, his retirement means that he has more free time to come and watch the show. I always tell him that I don't believe he is going to retire. When he stops showing up, then I'll believe him. But he's taught me to make all these decisions without him. He told me when we started that one of the reasons that I'm here is to make sure that when he's not around, things go the way he wants. And so I think it's a compliment to myself, my crew, and to the different divisions of Lucasfilm. He feels confident in all of us to say that he can retire. He's done a great thing for us as a company by bringing in Kathleen Kennedy to take over the reins. First off, he literally states George is still showing up and hasn't stopped. But his saying more time to watch the show doesn't mean he's never there and never watches it. It just means George could devote more time to Clone Wars than he already did, as George himself even said he wasn't involved in day-to-day duties. Dave said George basically trained him to run things the right way when George was no longer around, and now was that time, so up to this point at least George was still there. Another one from Dave, when asked if George was involved on a day-to-day basis, he says, "Well, he comes up with story ideas and presents them, and then we form the script, and it's really like a series of check-ins that we have with him sometimes pretty often. He's a really busy guy, so I'm very happy when we get his time. He's always available to me in the editorial stage." Yeah, right before that, Dave says George is there, and he's really engaged in what we're doing. We have the guy who created the Star Wars universe excited and interested about what we are doing in that universe. And right after that, he says, "I come up with ideas," and George comes to me with ideas and says, "I'd like to tell this kind of story. We'll collaborate on it." He's very involved in that part of the process. The quote anyway shows George was involved and was providing the stories. He just wasn't there day to day, but he was still there and sometimes a lot, but he was always there with Dave in the editorial stage. But I'm sure purists will say the rest was a lie, except for the one excerpt that suits their desired narrative, of course. Another one from Rob Coleman. But I was also trying to find a balance. This is Dave Filoni's show. Being asked to be the animation consultant and directing some episodes helped to move the series along. The magazine from an online image I found introduces Rob by saying Rob Coleman was the natural choice when George Lucas needed an animation supervisor to work on his ambitious new TV show. He also says George was the one who invited him to join Lucasfilm and to go out to Singapore. And also the look of the show came from George. George assigned him to work with Dave and Catherine to immerse them in the world of Star Wars. Rob Coleman says in the same interview, George remains very involved. He was extremely involved in the early days, working with Dave Filoni, the writers, the various episodic directors, and describing to us what he was looking for. I was always coaching directors to go and look at the original Star Wars movies so they had an idea of what kind of framing and cutting that George likes. Right before making the remarks about Dave Filoni's show, he mentions, "We looked at camera choices, cutting choices. George Lucas has a certain kind of lens, and there's a certain kind of cutting that he does. Once you become well-versed in that, you can make him very happy. I worked side by side with him for so many years that I had an advantage over the other episodic directors. I already knew how to communicate with George. I was very fluent in George Lucas, let's put it that way." To which he was asked, "So you knew what to expect," and then he responded with the initial quote. This is also the same interview where I pulled the previous Rob Coleman quote that goes into extensive detail about George's involvement. Anyone using this is straight up cherry picking. And even then, Rob Coleman isn't an insight into the entire show. He was involved, but later left after the beginning of season 2. Dave said, it was great having Rob Coleman there in the beginning. He was, as you know, a great mentor to me in the early days, just as far as how to, get used to George and communicate with him. Some will still insist George couldn't have been too involved, at least in the later seasons, because he stepped away to work on Red Tails. However, according to George in 2008, we've been doing this for 3 years. We have 1 year finished. We're in the middle of the second year. I've written the third year. We expect this to go on for at least 5 or 6 years. I mean, what I'm doing is I'm doing a film called Red Tails. I've been working on for years, and then I'm working on a live action TV series when we're in the script stage. George here confirms he had been working on Red Tails for years, and that didn't get in the way of the first 2 or 3 seasons of TCW. So why would that have gotten in the way of the 4th or 5th? Even then, other quotes have shown George was still involved, but some days he was there and some days he wasn't. This doesn't mean he was no longer involved. Also, Indiana Jones 4 came out in 2008 with production running over the previous year or two. Yet George was still involved in that and still involved in TCW, as he just admitted, so there's no reason why Red Tails would require him to step away, especially since George wasn't even the main director or writer on the film, and it wouldn't come out until early 2012. Some will bring up this quote from 2020 where George says, I've kind of lost control of Star Wars, so it's going off in a different path than what I intended, but the first 6 are very much mine and my philosophy. They will then ask if George really made TCW, why did he not bring that up as well? First off, the first 6 what? First 6 EU novels? The first 6 comics? First 6 animated shows? No? Ah, the first 6 Star Wars films. That's what. Also referring to how he lost control of the last Star Wars films. This has nothing to do with TCW, and if you want to read it as him excluding TCW, then you also have to read it as him excluding the EU. Also, as we've pointed out, George still referenced the Clone Wars after the buyout. He didn't speak often publicly about Star Wars besides the conventions, and when he did, it's normally been in terms about the general early development of the first film or his broad philosophies. But in the Star Wars Archives book, he made 2 references to the events of TCW. As I've already pointed out, you don't see him reference the events of the EU, especially after the buyout. If anything, we only have him dissing it, mainly those 2019 quotes where he throws shade at the idea of the EU with the Jedi versus Sith in the Old Republic. So no, once again, this quote is a nothing burger. Some will say TCW, at least seasons 5 and 6, couldn't have come from George since that was after the Disney acquisition, especially season 6. Well, TCW episodes enter development a long time before they premiere. This is how Star Wars animation runs. For example, as we talked about earlier, voice actress Tia Sakar, who portrayed Sabine in Star Wars Rebels, knew the ending of a show, something she only knew and no other actor knew since she was the narrator of the epilogue, a whole year before the air date. In 2012, Dave said this in a behind-the-scenes featurette. This is a spoiler, but the coolest helmets that the Wolfpack wears are the desert helmets. That season, I don't know, in the future. This is a behind-the-scenes featurette made for the DVD release of Season 4 of TCW, released on DVD October 23rd, meaning this was probably shot a couple months prior. Disney acquired Lucasfilm on October 30th, 2012. The helmets Dave is referring to appear in Season 6, Episode 10. So Season 6 was being developed as far back as 2012, if not earlier, meaning George absolutely would have been around to have input on the show's 6th season. According to a YouTube video with this URL on the screen, Dave said George still had some oversight in Season 6. It was certainly less of a presence than prior seasons. Stories would still have come from George, though. When asked by Leland Chi at a Q&A in 2014 if everything in the Yoda arc came from George or if Dave added anything, Dave simply said, I added Ahsoka. For those unfamiliar, this was one minor scene where the character was initially another random Padawan. And it was a visionary sequence. It wasn't Ahsoka back in the main timeline of events. Plus, on top of that, Star Wars Rebels Season 1 had a very rushed development. So there wasn't too much time to focus on TCW. It wasn't like Lucas was evicted and the show went a major reworking. It's pretty much wrap it up and stop what you're doing and move on to Rebels. Didn't Dave Filoni say George stepped away? In August 2012, when asked if George was still as hands-on as he always was, Dave said, he was very hands-on in the beginning. I would see him more than once a week at times. I used to put all the original designs, Anakin, Ahsoka, everything went through him. I would have them done and direct them to a certain point. So I thought they were ready, and then I would show them to him and say, what do you think of this? But once we established the look of the show, he did step back to a degree. but he will always be involved. He sees the story reel, which is a very rough form of an episode, so he watches that, and then he gives me notes. He used to come in for those, and we would sit together and watch them. Now he just calls me. I send him a DVD. He called me here out front of you saw me stooped over in the grass the other day, writing on the ground. I was scribbling notes because I was on the phone with him, and it's not like he didn't know where you were. Knew exactly where I was. He was like, "How's it going?" I'm like, "It's going great. Everybody loves the show." He's like, "Great, I got some notes for you." And I was like, "Great, let's get those down." And we did. And I have to say, they were great notes, great ideas. He does these little things that I think really make our episodes just that much better. He is brilliant at pointing out the kind of base logic stuff. Like, this dialogue doesn't make any sense here. You can't take it for granted that people are going to understand what's happening. And he's constantly policing that. So I do those changes. They're all minimal anymore, though, because we really try to work the way he's taught us. We try to get ahead of him. It's almost like a game, Challenge George Lucas. Can we make an action scene so he won't change it? Can we write a bunch of dialogue in a scene? So he's like, yeah, that's the way it goes. And we've gotten pretty good at it over the years. Then he watches the color. For those, he actually comes in and sits in the theater with us. And we all sit there and just watch the movie together. Again, this is from August 2012. This is several years into the show's development. We don't know when George stepped back. This could be a reference to 3 years ago. It could be a reference to 6 months ago. It's ambiguous. Keep in mind, we have records of interviews he gave in 2011 regarding the show, joint interviews alongside Dave Filoni. So he's still been involved. It's not like he just abandoned the show. Also, keep in mind that Dave never said George stepped away entirely here. He just said he has less of a presence than he did previously. So what was Lucas's role previously? We know he was very involved with story, but we've also shown examples of him still having a role in the story as late as season 5. And we've also established that his involvement for stories doesn't actually require too much time, a few days to a week per season. But we do also know that George was very involved in tons of other areas initially, having a much more hands-on role with the day-to-day duties. We've seen behind-the-scenes footage of him doing that. He saw episodes through various stages, he did some editing, worked with the music composers, etc. But as we've already shown, as time went on and the team got the hang of what they were doing, just like George intended for them, because George's goal was to be able to kind of step away and be involved story-wise but not day-to-day wise, so George was able to gradually step back and reduce his oversight to maybe once or twice a week, and now Dave says it seems to be a little less than that. But that has little impact on whether the stories come from him. Like I just said, we have accountings of others who have his involvement with story being very heavy, even late into season 5. In fact, Dave says here that he loves season 5, and that's gotta include the Ahsoka stuff everybody likes to bring up and think that Dave went behind George's back on. George has owned the final arc of season 6 as part of the story. But his story involvement wasn't super time consuming, like I just said, so him stepping back is clearly a reference to him pulling back on the day to day duties, something Filoni was eventually able to get the hang of and manage by himself. Dave never says here that the story stopped coming from George. In fact, other accounts demonstrate the complete opposite. Also, too, keep in mind that Dave still says here he's showing George rough cuts of episodes as they're being worked on, and George is giving notes and expecting things to be changed. It just isn't in person like it used to be. But he's still being shown the final episode in color, which I assume means the final animated and lit episode shortly before it goes to air, though it could be a rougher form. It still has George showing up in person to check those out. He's not doing it distantly. He's still coming in theater. They talk. That's what Dave says in the rest of this little brief interview. So, this quote, again, is a nothing burger. George was still very involved with the stories of the show, and he still approved episodes, and at the end of the day, that's what matters. Dave even said, though George stepped back, he will still always be involved. The minutia of day-to-day animation production not being done by him or overseen every day by him has little bearing on whether the stories from the show are from him or not, especially since, as I said, he's still approved episodes and he never stopped showing up or being involved, period. It was just a lesser degree. Some may ask why TCW was T canon and not G canon. After all, if it was George's, then it should be G canon. I can't find a source on why, but Leland said T canon was TCW and Underworld. My guess is the films were mainly George, whereas TCW and Underworld would have much more substantive involvement from other collaborators by nature of the medium. But even then, as I've already talked about, that doesn't make too much sense. But Leland still called T Canon a pillar of George like G Canon. Some may still insist that it was Dave's show, not George's, and Dave was calling day-to-day shots, so it was more his vision than George's. To that I say, what if some of Dave's vision is in there? That doesn't mean it's not also George's. There were others involved in the original trilogy. Only 4 was directed by George. Only 4 was written by George. There was also a producer on the films that had influence on the final product. The prequel trilogy, while more George than the original trilogy, still had other influences. 2 had a co-writer. The visual effects team had lots of leeway on certain things. As I mentioned before, Rob Coleman spoke in the ILM documentary at length about being the one to have to plan out the entirety of the Yoda fight and also being the one to propose CG Yoda to George. Having some of Dave's vision in there doesn't rob it from being George. After all the EU content was way more someone else's vision than George's, yet EU purists will still try to say that's George's true continuation of the saga. So does that same logic mean the EU was canon if I'm saying TCW was? No, but that's not due to a hypocrisy stance on my take about the involvement. It's because George actively disavowed the EU. Even post-Disney, he still owned TCW as his, but never with the EU. So if TCW was his, why didn't he come out and own it? Well, first off, he did. He did active press for the '08 film. As for the show, George did talk about it being his, but he wasn't out answering critics and playing continuity defense. He wasn't a big PR guy. Even for the prequels, there was really only 1 or 2 maybe interviews where he played prequel apologetics. Most of his press stuff was just talking about the movie and the making of it. He also had Dave to advertise the show for him and own it for him, which is part of what Dave was hired to do. On top of that, between TCW, Red Tails, Indy 4, and eventually the sequels and the Disney acquisition, George didn't have time for press when he had people like Dave to do it for him. Again, that's what Dave was for, though George did occasionally do some. After all, it's important to keep in mind the way TCW operated was his ideal way for a project operation. Directing A New Hope almost killed him. He was hospitalized from the stress. He tried to step back on TSB and Return of the Jedi, but when it came time for the prequels, he only directed them because no one else wanted to take the job. He tried offering it to 3 or 4 different directors. He told Charlie Rose in a 2015 interview, the most fun movie to work on was Indiana Jones because I didn't have to direct it. According to Tom Dupree in a 1997 interview with The New Yorker, Lucas told him, when you're directing, you can't see the whole picture. You want to take a step back, be the overall force behind it, like a television executive producer. Some will prop up the idea that George was influenced by prequel hate, and that's why even though he was involved, it wasn't his true vision, so it could be discarded as not real Star Wars. I've heard this argument raised in response to the idea that Anakin is a different character in TCW than the prequels, and that it retcons the film, so if it came from George, then it was him giving into the hate. I don't see it that way. I think TCW is just his ideas, but better fleshed out by other writers and in a longer form story due to the nature of TV versus film. When asked by Charlie Rose if Star Wars was his crowning achievement, George said, cinematically, I'd probably say yes. When asked in what way it wasn't, he said, I don't know. Again, it's hard to, I have a pretty low opinion of my movies. So to me, I've always said these didn't really turn out the way I hoped they would. I could see all the flaws and I could see all the stuff. George has admitted to struggling with writing, especially with the love story in Attack of the Clones. I think the perceived differences are just him better executing the ideas he had for the prequels. That doesn't mean at all he was influenced by prequel hate. Howard Rothman said in 2010, you have to understand how George Lucas works, and I've been working with him for 30 years. He's driven by his personal vision. He believes in the integrity of that, and he doesn't believe in letting outside forces like studios, research, or fans, for that matter, etc., interfere with the story he wanted to tell. That doesn't sound like the description of someone who hates his life work. And that was in 2010. And for those who insist that clearly TCW was just an apology for the prequels, and therefore it could be discarded, I then ask this follow-up question. Should we discard the 6 films? I could make an argument for the same principle being applied to those. Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith were compromised for prequel hate. Jar Jar's role was heavily reduced following the backlash. Dialogue coaches were brought in, presumably to help with the criticized performances. George also made story changes. He said in 2018, I was going to put more about the midi-chlorians and the wills after episode 1, but everyone freaked out and said, we don't like this, it's terrible, so I didn't. Also, I had an investment in the whole thing financially, so I was forced to relent because I knew it was self-indulgent. But I was very keen to have it be in the movies, and if I'd gone on to do the last three, it would have been explained there. So if we're using the same logic to discard TCW, does that mean we get to discard episodes 2 and 3? Another point to consider is that regarding episode 3, the film had to have extensive reshoots to reshape the story. As discussed in The Making of Revenge of the Sith by J.W. Rinsler, the story was originally much less focused on Anakin, and Anakin's main motivations were obsession and corruption with power, as well as disillusionment with the Jedi. In fact, he was present when Mace Windu went to confront Palpatine, and it was Anakin's perception of this event that led him to turn on the Jedi. However, originally Anakin's fall was poorly received by test audiences who didn't buy it, so George heavily reworked the movie, made his motivations Padme's impending doom, and a lot of the side plots were dropped to hone in on Anakin's story. So since George had to rework his original vision because audiences didn't like it, should we cut out episode 3? What about the original trilogy? George was heavily restricted by technology. Sure, he modified some of that with the special edition, but look at how the prequels came out, and then just think about how the original trilogy would have come out had George made them in the 90s. His vision was compromised there too. Also, story threads George wanted to save for a hypothetical sequel trilogy, like Luke's sister, were rushed and wrapped up in Return of the Jedi when personal and financial circumstances led him to realize that after Return of the Jedi, it was time to stop. So is Return of the Jedi not his true vision either? Where do we draw the line? I've seen some even suggest post prequel trilogy George no longer even cared about Star Wars and he was just cashing in on the cow after all the prequel hate. Seems though George would disagree. In 2015, well, all my films are personal. And TCW was a film he said he made. In 2015, I like Star Wars. George didn't hate Star Wars. The real thrill was when I see some of those things, but I see the fans, and when we were in Spain shooting Padme's palace, there were 10,000 like there, but they were all tiny little kids. They were reaching through this fence. It was a metal that was like the White House. It's a national landmark, that palace, and they were all reaching their hands out, even the little tiny ones. They had no idea who I was, but all they wanted to do was touch my hand and said, this is what I did it for. Everything. None of it makes any difference except, in the real world, the critics, certain fans and things, they're not very kind. But when you see all these little kids and you see the look on their face and what it means to them, it forgives everything. George clearly still knew it was worth it. And this was during the prequel trilogy filming. Plus, if The Clone Wars was to save face, well, the film was very poorly received and it's still the worst rated Star Wars movie on Rotten Tomatoes. So if that's all TCW was about, he should have either changed strategies after the film came out or called it quits. But he didn't. I've seen some pose the question, understandably so, if TCW was George's, why would he sell? That's like selling after Attack of the Clones and before Revenge of the Sith. Well, first off, I could throw this back on the EU purists regarding the EU novels still in development, like Kenobi, for example, which filled in the gaps of the story about one of the saga's most crucial characters in the 20-year time period of his life between films not explored before. Second off, as we'll discuss later in the sequel trilogy section, George selling the company did not mean he was going to walk away and wash his hands of Star Wars. He still expected to be involved. He sold in October 2012 and only departed in early 2013, once he found out his treatments were being discarded. Initially, he probably planned to still be involved in TCW just like the sequel trilogy. The ending of the show was already planned out either way. Yes, scripts and previs and animation and voice work still need to be done, but the basic concept of the story of the Siege of Mandalore was planned by the time the show was canceled. Even if George departed entirely, as Dave said, George trained him to make decisions the way George wanted them for when he was no longer there. And all the stories of the show were mapped out, they just needed to be executed. That said, there was immense pressure from George to sell. As he told Charlie Rose in 2015, one of the reasons I sold was I was starting to make movies that were more personal and were obviously losing a lot of money. And I said, I can't really do this much more because the company will be dragged down. And I had 2,000 employees, so I had people to think about. So I said the best way to handle this is to sell it, then take the money, put it in a bank account, and I will use that to make movies that I know are experimental, that I have no way of knowing whether they'll work out or not. I made the decision to sell the company. For Star Wars, I made that decision because I looked at the future. I looked at the thought that I was going to have a baby. I looked at the fact that I was married. And I looked at the fact that I wanted to build a museum. And I looked at the fact that I wanted to make experimental films. And so my life was going on a different track. And I noticed the last few movies that I made were costing the company a lot of money. And I didn't think that was fair to the people that worked there or the company. When asked if he sold his company because he was tired, George said, "Well, I turned 70. My whole life centered around me doing these avant-garde experimental films that you don't know whether they're going to work or not. You kind of are playing with the medium, which is what I wanted to do. And all my student films are like that. Everything I did was like that. Even THX is vaguely like that. And I always said if this fails, I'm going to go back to doing my experimental films. All my friends, Marty Francis, Steven, said, "Well, when are you going to do experimental films?" And I said, "Well, I got caught in this tar baby called Star Wars and lots of opportunities and lots of things." And so I said, "Well, I like Star Wars. I fell in love with it and I want to complete it." And after I completed it, I produced films and things at the same time. I came back and did the backstory to the whole thing. And I felt, well, at some point there is three more stories, but it takes 10 years to do that, to do all three of them. And I said, I don't think I could do that. And I want to go do my little experimental films. And I was commuting between Chicago and San Francisco. So I said, I'm going to take my life and make it so I can live in Chicago, live in San Francisco, make my little art films, build a museum, take care of my little daughter. And that's what's important to me because the other part is at the height of my career after Jedi, I had a daughter who was a year old. I was married. My wife, we got divorced, and I was left with a baby. She was adopted. And when I first held her in my arms in the hospital, a lightning bolt struck me. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me. So when she left, I took the baby and said, I'm going to retire. I don't want to direct any more movies because you can't raise kids and direct movies because it's literally 4 in the morning till 10 at night, working weekends, working all the time. And you just can't do that. George told Charlie Rose when asked in 2015 that he wanted his tombstone not to say Star Wars creator, but good dad instead. Lucas put Star Wars on hold the first time around post original trilogy when his kids entered the picture and only went back once they grew up. He now had another daughter with his new wife, and that was priority number one. On top of that, the company was financially struggling, and TCW was also a show losing money and viewership. This is why when he sold, he put Kathy in charge, hoping to still have a role, but a lesser one in light of his new child. On top of that, he really, honestly, with the timetable, he didn't have 2 or 3 more years to stick around and keep making Clone Wars at the way he's describing the financial state of the company. So it had nothing to do with leading Clone Wars. It was about protecting people because, again, George is not a jerk. He's going to take care of his employees. Okay, so at this point, we've pretty clearly established TCW is from George. So will the EU purists accept it? Some will still reject it because they believe the EU is George's true Star Wars and TCW retcons it, mainly the Clone Wars multimedia project. But the EU has some retcons of its own. Most EU purists will happily accept the O3 Clone Wars, even though it mostly operated separately from the EU. In the two O3 Clone Wars BTS featurettes, Bridging the Galaxy and Connecting the Dots, both of which are available online, they're like 7 minutes each, go ahead and check them out. The showrunners talk about basically coming up with the stories themselves, not with George like TCW. His only instructions for Genndy were to resolve the Ipori cliffhanger in Volume 2 and to do the Battle of Coruscant. A quote from the two showrunners: "We had certain goals in mind that we wanted to hit, like on certain people. We wanted to address the friendship between Anakin and Obi-Wan. Since we know episode 3, their friendship has the big falling out, this is our last chance to let people know they're pals." If they were in touch with the EU, they should have known that was something that was established. There's also the issue of Anakin's knighting. The EU novel Jedi Trial takes place 2.5 years into the war. This contradicts the date given by the Revenge of the Sith novelization. For canon tiers, that must remove this story. The O3 series implies Anakin is promoted early into the war. Hypori is early, and it is the Jedi defeat at the Battle of Hypori that leads to the Council debating Anakin's knighthood. Kenobi references Anakin's duel with Dooku in Attack of the Clones, and his duel with Ventress on Yavin in Volume 1 as Anakin's trials. The novel attempts to tell us the story of Anakin's actual Jedi trial, but the showrunners had a different idea in mind. We thought, oh, let's give him the knighthood, and then he's going to have his trials after, and we got excited about that idea. Then he started to structure our story based on that theme. What situation are we going to put Anakin that could be like a trial? They start talking about the Nelvana sequences after this. It's pretty clear Genndy had nothing to do with the story of the novel, and considering after the knighthood is when there's a random montage of Anakin fighting battles across the galaxy, and the knighthood is right after the Hypori sequences, I think it's clearly that's when the time jump is supposed to take place. Any first-time viewer of the series will walk away with that interpretation only. If the EU can't even get the major event of Anakin's knighthood straightened out, why should we value the Clone Wars multimedia project over TCW? It clearly wasn't too coordinated between publishing and television. The same could be said about the Clone War 03 series killing off Karuk, only for Dark Horse to not be happy about that and resurrect him anyway. Speaking of resurrections, a lot of EU fans were mad about Koth coming back in TCW after reference material said one of the exploding gunships in Attack of the Clones had him on there, even though the 03 series used a Zabrak Jedi with the appearance of Ethkoth, and that had to be retconned to be Agent Kolar because of their hair. But Sora Bulk also was on the same gunship according to EU reference material, and he survived and popped up in the Clone Wars multimedia project. Padme sees Anakin's scar for the first time 3 different times. The Obsession comics, 03 Clone Wars series, and the Revenge of the Sith novel. While it's possible Obsession and 03 Clone Wars are supposed to be the same scene, the lack of continuity regarding Anakin's knighting makes me think otherwise. It's clearly separate from the Revenge of the Sith novel either way. Clone Wars series in 03 also tells a different version of events of the Battle of Coruscant depicted in Labyrinth of Evil. While it would appear the reasoning was production timelines and changes, it's still a retcon that exists within the timeline. In comment sections, I've still engaged with people who refuse to accept TCW because it retcons the films. They'll give out various retcons that can be reconciled, just like other EU or film retcons, but because they don't like TCW, they won't put any effort into doing some critical thinking or resolve the matter. The video isn't really a TCW apologist video, but since it's relevant, I'll briefly address these supposed retcons. Anakin's character seems to be the biggest one. This is something I've already addressed. Anakin is simply at the worst points in his life during episodes 2 and 3. TCW is everyday Anakin. TCW also explored his maturing by introducing Ahsoka, forcing him to grow up so he can be responsible. Some say they prefer the slow maturing in the Clone Wars multimedia project. That's fine. There's nothing wrong about this. It's war. Sometimes in real life, kids are forced to mature when they have to take on a parental role. It's similar here. Anakin is otherwise still the same character as he is in the films. He's emotional, a struggling Jedi, rebellious, struggling with attachments, struggling with inner darkness, while trying to be a good Jedi, and he's brash and impulsive. The only one I can kind of understand is the voice change, but even then, it's not too different. This is animation where things are a little stylized. The next retcon I've seen is Ahsoka. Her being Anakin's Padawan doesn't retcon the films. There was no allusion to him not having a Padawan, even if she wasn't mentioned in Revenge of the Sith. Well, Qui-Gon wasn't mentioned in the original trilogy, but he still exists. Ahsoka being off and on her own mission isn't really relevant to the story Anakin is experiencing in the film, especially since Padme quickly becomes his main and only priority. And if you criticize the Jedi Council for giving Anakin a Padawan, well, the Jedi Council made a lot of mistakes and dumb decisions, and some would argue that was the point of the trilogy. They were basically given the Sith's plot in Attack of the Clones by Dooku and did nothing. They didn't investigate the clones right away. They sent Anakin on a solo mission with Padme, even though Obi-Wan tells them he has a crush on her, and even knowing after this, they let Anakin take her back to Naboo after their whole little moment in Attack of the Clones. And in Revenge of the Sith, Anakin can still spend the night at Padme's place during Episode 3, and the Council can't put 2 and 2 together? General Grievous's death is the key to ending the war, and instead of sending several Jedi, they send Obi-Wan alone, even though other Jedi are on Coruscant? And after learning Palpatine is a Sith, they only send 4 Jedi, so the Jedi making a dumb decision with Ahsoka and Anakin fits right in, if you really want to perceive it that way. Plus, the goal of Ahsoka was to mature Anakin after his issues in Attack of the Clones by forcing him to grow up, so it makes sense. Another retcon I've seen is being the guilds and corporate neutrality as presented in the show. The thing is, everyone knows they're guilty of sin, but they can't prove it. Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones established this, especially with Newt Gunray escaping 4 trials, and some senators are on their payroll anyway. Obi-Wan witnessed their meeting in Episode 2 with Dooku, sure, but what good is eyewitness testimony as we saw with the blockade of Naboo in Episode 1? Another big one is the inhibitor chips. I've made a video about why I think this works better, but just as for the retcon, Sam Witwer resolved this in a quote I already brought up. As he points out, Cody calls Palpatine my lord, but Palpatine isn't emperor yet, and the clones don't know he's a Sith. Some level of brainwashing is implied. I've even seen some people get upset because the Kaminoans say the clones are genetically modified to follow orders, even though the chips are basically a form of genetically modifying the clone to obey an order. On top of that, even if the Kaminoans are basically saying that they tampered with the DNA of the clones, and that's supposed to be our Order 66 explanation, adding inhibitor chips does not contradict that, as it's still an organic modification and tampering, but it's basically just an extra safeguard. It doesn't contradict, it just expands. Also, the Kaminoans don't really know the true nature of the inhibitor chips as we see in TCW. Dooku lies to them and tells them it's simply a safeguard against rogue Jedi. So the Kaminoans establishing the genetic modifications in Attack of the Clones isn't a retcon because the Kaminoans don't even know what the chips really do or their true purpose. Also, too, keep in mind that the Kaminoans were told by Dooku that the Jedi couldn't know anything about the inhibitor chips and what they did and what they were meant for. And once the Jedi started to kind of find out in Season 6, the Kaminoans were told to keep as much hidden as possible. So, sure enough, when Obi-Wan shows up in Attack of the Clones, the Kaminoans not just going to go, oh yeah, by the way, they have these inhibitor chips in there that are meant for as safeguards for rogue Jedi. They're going to keep it hush-hush and keep it quiet. They're not going to scream it out loud to the Jedi. I've seen it suggested, too, that the clones don't have free will, that they're essentially mindless droids with few exceptions, but the Kaminoans saying clones can think creatively seems to imply there is some sort of free will and free thought on their behalf. And of course, moving on, a retcon often brought up is Anakin fighting Dooku and Kenobi fighting Grievous. First off, Anakin fighting Dooku isn't an explicit retcon, it's just the implication of the line that's retconned. And while it is a little funky, it's not universe breaking. Chalk it up to poor trash talk. And as for Kenobi fighting Grievous, it could be chalked up to either poor trash talk or Grievous receiving new training from Dooku after Ventress's departure, with him only knowing combat before that due to his prior life as a warrior, which I actually think is a really cool explanation. Also, regarding the Dooku thing, Anakin and Dooku fight in the Clone Wars film that George Lucas was a major part of, and on top of that, did press for. So, if you have an issue with that, you gotta take that up with George Lucas. The other major one I see brought up is Kenobi finding out Dooku is Tyrannus. There's a whole explanation I could get into, but I'll try to sum it up by the point that the damage was done. It was too late to do anything, and even then, by episode 3, they were skeptical of Palpatine, and this might just be the canon reason why. Dooku straight up tells them in Attack of the Clones what's going on, and they ignore it anyway, so I don't see how this is too different. Even so, from in-universe, there was no real way out of this. Public opinion was already turning against them. To find out they've been fighting with an army made by Dooku would blow things out of the water. It'd be similar to if we suddenly learned the whole US Army was conditioned by the Russians. How would that play out? We also don't have proof other than eyewitness testimony, and even then, they'd look like idiots for not having investigated that sooner. They can't recuse themselves from the war because not only would innocents die while they take a stand, but the Republic would lose the war and Dooku would basically take control of the galaxy via that way, letting the Sith win. So, yeah, they couldn't raise a new army. The clones have been fighting for over 2 years with the Jedi by this point. They didn't have any inherent reason to distrust them. As for why it's not connected to the chips from a few episodes back, probably because to them that matter was resolved and they moved on. Keep in mind, from the Jedi's perspective, it's basically a clone that went mad and shot his Jedi. He died, and then another clone went AWOL and died. The chips inside them were pretty much sold to the Jedi as genetic modifications the Kaminoans told Kenobi about. Yeah, Fives told Anakin that was a plot to destroy the Jedi, but Anakin clearly didn't believe him, especially once the Chancellor was brought up in that. As for Yoda's visions later, again, it's just that, visions. Yoda's quick to ignore visions, saying always in motion is the future. And it was one vision that had the Jedi fighting the clones. The rest of his visions had nothing to do with them. On top of that, we don't know the Sith Lord's plan, and acting out could be their downfall. So yeah, all in all, I don't see it as a universe-breaking issue. Even though retcons can be subjective at times, 2000's prequel haters had a long list of retcons between the trilogies. I don't think a lot of them hold up. I think a lot of the ones from TCW could be resolved. And let's say, for argument's sake, there are retcons between the films and TCW. So, there are retcons between the film trilogies. Empire says Obi-Wan's master was Yoda, the Jedi Master who instructed me, not a Jedi Master. So do we throw out Phantom Menace? Even if Episode 2 tried to fix it by showing Yoda teaching younglings, this was after the fact fix with Episode 1, which makes no mention of that, and even then, it's not really stated Kenobi did train with Yoda as a youngling except for in Clone Wars Season 6. Return of the Jedi established Leia knew her mother. Revenge of the Sith retcon that. Do we throw 3 out? Episode 4 established the Republic was 1,000 generations, but Episode 2 said 1,000 years. Do we throw that out? Episode 4 established Leia as an Organa. Episode 6 retcon that with her as Luke's sister. Do we throw that out? A New Hope established Anakin and Vader were separate people, and the early Empire scripts proved this. The Vader change came later, and Empire retconned Anakin and Vader to be one and the same, leaving Return of the Jedi to have to try to sort it out. Did we throw out Empire? A New Hope established the Jedi and Republic as ancient and long gone. The prequels revealed that it was less than 20 years. Did we throw out the whole prequel trilogy? Return of the Jedi establishes Obi-Wan takes Anakin on as his Padawan, but Phantom Menace shows he has no choice but to do it because Qui-Gon essentially made him. Do we throw out Phantom Menace? Where do we draw the line? If we're allowing wiggle room for the films, we have to allow wiggle room for TCW as well. I would also point out that the '03 Clone Wars retcons the films in some areas, but the EU purists happily accept that. In Attack of the Clones, Mace, along with 200 Jedi, lose to the droids in the Patranki Arena and Geonosis, and many Jedi perish. But a few weeks later, in the '03 series, Mace single-handedly takes on an entire army of droids, missing his lightsaber through half of that, and wins the battle. If the Mace we saw in the '03 Clone Wars was in Attack of the Clones, the Jedi would have stopped the war before it even started. The Grievous that we see in the EU in '03 Clone Wars is a completely different character than Revenge of the Sith. If the '03 Grievous fought Kenobi on Utapau, he would have died. I've seen some suggest it's because his chest was crushed, but the cough is what led to the crushed chest being added, and the cough was a last-minute add on the part of George Lucas. Originally, Grievous was still the same guy he was in Episode 3, but without the cough. He is fundamentally a different character in 3 than in the Clone Wars multimedia project. In the Clone Wars Volume 2 commentary, a producer I don't know by the name of had this exchange with Genndy. Because I think George hadn't really locked down what exactly he wanted to do with the character of Grievous. Yeah, the George pitched Grievous to me was that he was kind of one of those old serial villains where he does something bad and then he twirls his mustache and runs off and he always escapes. But before that, it's like we had been told that he's like this ruthless, totally capable Jedi killer. So it's like, well, yeah, I think he was still kind of working it out. So even the '03 guys knew that Grievous was kind of a different character. It's not just in the Clone Wars. The game Star Wars X-Wing, along with the Death Star novel, established Despair was the first planet the Death Star completely destroyed, even though A New Hope established Alderaan was the first planet destroyed upon the stations becoming completely operational. If EU purists stick to canon tiers and the novels are G-canon, then we have even further issues. 4's novel says Palpatine was a manipulated politician. Do we throw the other films out that contradict that? Return of the Jedi's novelization says Owen and Obi-Wan are brothers, and the whole splitting up the twins is different than Revenge of the Sith. Do we throw Episode 3 out? I also went over several retcons between the films and the EU, so unless we were prepared to throw out several prominent EU stories from the EU continuity, as well as the '03 series and droids, and are prepared to throw out basically all films aside A New Hope, well, we need to chill out. If we're allowing wiggle room for the film's retcons from later films, then we need to allow TCW to remain. And that's even if they really are retcons, which I don't think they are. Some may still push back and say retcons between collective G canon sources and between G and T canon sources are different. But I would say George never operated under the canon tiers. He put TCW on par with the films, and even Leland Cheese has suggested such by saying G canon and T canon are Lucas pillars. So true George Lucas fans wouldn't make such tier distinctions between G and T canon like Lucas Licensing did. I think it's pretty clear at this point that George Lucas was involved in TCW. The stories mainly came from him. He oversaw and approved what was made, and the alleged retcons are merely subjective and aren't grounds to remove it from the canon, unless you're taking that logic to its complete and extreme conclusion. The idea that TCW ignored the EU was approved and allowed by George, and the fact that it did so is consistent with his various statements and that of Lucasfilm officials over the years. TCW is definitive proof that George did not consider the EU canon. But if you're still really not convinced, then let's talk about an even bigger blow: the George Lucas sequel trilogy treatments.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. If you liked the video, comment down below and hit that like button. Oh, and check out some of my other videos. I'm sure you'll find them a delight.